Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most terrifying questions. What could possibly make a man volunteer to be the first one up a siege ladder? Picture this. You're standing at the base of a stone wall 40 feet high. Above you, enemy soldiers are waiting with arrows, rocks, boiling oil, and pure hatred. The ladder in front of you is your only path forward. And here's the thing. Everyone knows that the first man up that ladder almost never comes back down alive. Yet throughout history, from ancient Rome to Napoleon's wars, men fought each other for the privilege of climbing first. They volunteered, they competed. Some even argued about who got there first because the reward was that valuable. So what was worth dying for? What could make certain death feel like an opportunity? Tonight, we're going to find out. Before we climb into this story together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if it genuinely resonates with you. And hey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Are you in bed, on a couch, maybe listening while you work? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's step back in time to a place where courage and madness walked hand in hand. Let me take you to a place you don't want to be. It's dawn. You're a soldier in a besieging army, and you've been camped outside this fortified city for weeks. Your back aches from sleeping on cold ground. You're hungry, the rations are getting thin, and worst of all, you're bored. Sieges are brutally boring until the moment they're not. Then comes the order. Today we assault the walls. Your stomach drops. Because unlike a normal battle where you can at least swing your sword, fight back, feel like you have a chance, assaulting a wall is different. It's vertical. It's exposed. It's a nightmare made real. Here's what you're facing. Imagine a stone wall 30 to 50 feet high. That's about as tall as a 4 or 5-story building. At the top of that wall are soldiers who've had weeks to prepare. They've stockpiled ammunition, rocks the size of your head, spears, arrows. Some have cauldrons of water boiling over fires. Others have prepared pitch, basically medieval napalm, sticky, burning, and utterly horrifying. And you've got a wooden ladder. Let me paint you the full picture of what climbing that ladder actually means, because Hollywood really doesn't do it justice. First, you have to get the ladder to the wall. These aren't the lightweight aluminum ladders from Home Depot. We're talking about 40-foot wooden beams, heavy enough that it takes a dozen men to carry one, and you're not carrying it across your backyard. You're hauling it across a killing ground, an open space of maybe 100 yards, where the defenders have clear shots at you. So you're running, or more accurately, struggling forward with 11 other guys, this massive ladder bouncing on your shoulders while arrows are falling around you like deadly rain. Men are screaming, dropping. Maybe the guy next to you takes an arrow through the throat, and suddenly his weight is gone and the ladder lurches sideways. But let's say you make it. You get the ladder to the base of the wall. You prop it up, and immediately you've got a new problem. The angle. Too steep and the ladder won't be strong enough. Men climbing will pull it backward. Too shallow, and the top of the ladder sticks up above the wall, giving defenders an easy target to push it away. The perfect angle, according to medieval military engineers, is when the base of the ladder sits at a distance from the wall equal to about half the ladder's length. So for a 40-foot ladder, you're placing the base about 20 feet from the wall. Do the geometry and you realize you're climbing at a pretty steep angle, essentially pulling yourself up while wearing armor and carrying weapons. Now comes the truly terrifying part. You start climbing. With each rung, you're more exposed. Your hands are gripping the ladder, so you can't hold a shield properly. Your head's down, focused on not falling, which means you can't see what's coming from above. You're just vulnerable. Completely, utterly vulnerable. And the defenders? They're not sitting idle. They're methodically trying to kill you. First come the arrows, Not the movie kind where one arrow dramatically strikes the hero. No, we're talking volleys. Dozens of arrows at once, a storm of them, and you're the target. Some soldiers tried to hold shields above their heads while climbing, but think about the physics of that. You're gripping a ladder with one hand, holding a shield up with the other, trying to climb, and oh yeah, you're wearing 60 pounds of armor. Most men couldn't manage it. If you survive the arrows, next come the rocks, and I'm not talking pebbles. Defenders would haul up stones the size of basketballs, sometimes bigger. They'd simply drop them, letting gravity do the work. A 20-pound rock falling 40 feet will shatter a skull even through a helmet. The sound of those impacts on metal and bone, well, survivors described it as unforgettable. But wait, there's more. Because medieval defenders had an absolutely ruthless bag of tricks. Boiling water was common. It's easy to make. You've always got water, always got fire, and it's devastatingly effective. When that hits you, it seeps through the gaps in your armor, scalding your skin. The pain is so intense that men would simply let go of the ladder and fall. Boiling oil was rarer because oil was expensive, but when they had it, they used it. And here's the truly horrific part about oil versus water. Oil sticks. Water scalds you and runs off. Oil adheres to your skin, to your clothes, and keeps burning. Some defenders use sand. They'd heat sand until it was scorching hot, then pour it down on climbers. Sand gets everywhere, into your armor, into your eyes, into any gap in your protection, and it stays hot, burning you continuously. Then there's the psychological warfare of it. Defenders would sometimes heat pitch or tar until it was liquid and flaming, then pour it down. The sight of liquid fire cascading toward you, the smell of it, the screams of men below who've been hit. It wasn't just physically dangerous, it was mentally shattering. And if you somehow miraculously survive all of that and actually reach the top of the ladder, you still aren't safe. Not even close. Because now you're at the wall's edge, and there are defenders right there, fresh, uninjured, and very motivated to kill you. They've got spears, swords, and the massive advantage of solid ground beneath their feet while you're still on a ladder, off balance, exhausted from the climb. Many men were simply pushed backward. After everything, the arrows, the rocks, the boiling liquids, they'd reach the top only to have a defender plant a spear in their chest or simply shove them. The fall alone from 40 feet was usually fatal, and that's if you fell onto ground. Often, you'd land on the men climbing behind you, or on the rocks and debris at the wall's base. Oh, and I almost forgot. The defenders also tried to push the ladders themselves. If they could get a pole under the top of your ladder and lever it sideways or backward, everyone on that ladder was going down. Imagine being halfway up, focused on climbing, when suddenly the ladder begins to fall. That moment of weightlessness, then the impact, it killed as many men as the arrows did. Modern historians have tried to calculate the survival rates for ladder assaults, and the numbers are chilling. In a typical escalade, that's the fancy military term for ladder assault, casualty rates for the first wave range from 60 to 80%. Read that again, 60 to 80%. That means if 10 men started climbing ladders, only 2 or 3 would live to tell about it. Some specific sieges were even worse. At the Siege of Badajoz in 1812, we'll talk more about this later, the British lost 4,800 men in just a few hours of assault. The breaches in the wall became so packed with dead and wounded bodies that attackers literally had to climb over mounds of their own casualties. A British officer who survived that night wrote, "The ditches were so filled with dead that you could walk across on bodies alone." That's not poetic exaggeration. That's a literal description. So let's be crystal clear about what we're discussing. Volunteering to be the first up the ladder wasn't brave in the heroic movie sense. It was statistically suicidal. You weren't facing danger, you were facing near certain death. Any rational person looking at those odds would say, absolutely not, no way, find someone else. And yet, men volunteered, not just a few desperate souls, enough that armies often had to hold competitions or draw lots to decide who got the honor. Experienced soldiers, men who'd survived multiple battles, men who knew exactly what they were facing, they raised their hands. Why? That's not a rhetorical question. It's the real mystery, because the reward they were competing for had to be extraordinary. It had to be worth more than life itself. It had to offer something so valuable that certain death looked like a fair trade. And here's what makes this even more fascinating. The rewards did exist. They were real, and they were so powerful, so life-changing that they created a system where men genuinely believed that dying on a ladder was their best chance at a better future. I know that sounds insane, but stick with me because what we're about to discover is a window into human motivation that's just as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. We're going to meet the men who climbed these ladders, understand what they were really fighting for, and realize that their choices reveal something profound about courage, ambition, and what it means to risk everything. In the next part of our journey, we're heading to ancient Rome, to the year 209 BC, where two soldiers are about to have an argument that will change their families' destinies for generations. They're going to fight not with swords, but with words over who climbed a wall first. And what they're fighting for is a golden crown that could make them immortal. But that's coming up next. For now, let this sink in. Somewhere in history, a soldier stood at the base of a ladder, looked up at certain death and thought, yes, this is my moment. What could possibly be worth that? Stay with me and we'll find out together. So here's where our story gets really interesting. Because while soldiers throughout history faced those terrifying ladders, the Romans, being Romans, turned this nightmare into a competition, and they created a prize so valuable, so life-changing, that it sparked arguments, rivalries, and legacy battles that lasted for generations. Let me take you to Spain in the year 209 BC. It's a scorching afternoon, and the city of New Carthage has just fallen to Roman forces. The battle is over, the dust is settling, and two soldiers are about to get into a fight. Not with swords, they're on the same side. They're fighting with words, and they're fighting over something that sounds almost ridiculous. Who climbed the wall first? His name is Quintus Trebellius. He's a centurion, basically a middle-ranking officer in the Roman army. Tough guy, battle-scarred, the kind of man who's earned his position through years of service. And right now, he's absolutely furious, because standing across from him is another soldier claiming the same honor. His name is Sextus Digitus, and he's a marine, a sailor who fights on ships. Different branch, different background, but same claim. I was first on that wall. Now, you might be thinking, why does it matter who was first? They both survived, they both fought bravely, can't they share the glory? Oh, my friend, you don't understand Romans. What these two men are arguing about isn't just pride. It's not some participation trophy. They're fighting over something called the corona muralis, the mural crown. And in the Roman world, this crown was worth more than gold. It was worth more than money. It was worth everything. Let me show you what I mean. The corona muralis was physically a crown made of gold and shaped to look like the battlements of a city wall. Imagine a golden headband with little tower shapes jutting up from it, crenellations like you'd see on a castle. It wasn't particularly large or flashy, but when a Roman writer named Aulus Gellius described it centuries later, he talked about it with reverence. This wasn't jewelry. This was history made wearable. The rules for earning it were brutally simple. Be the first soldier over an enemy wall during an assault. Plant your feet on the enemy battlements before anyone else. Survive. That's it. And here's the thing that made the Corona Moralis so incredibly rare and valuable. Only one person could win it per siege. One. Because by definition, only one man can be first. Second place? That's just first loser. No crown for you. Now, the Romans weren't naive. They knew that in the chaos of battle, with smoke and screaming and hundreds of men climbing dozens of ladders, it might not be clear who actually reached the top first. So they had a system. After the battle, there would be an investigation. Witnesses would testify. Commanders would weigh the evidence. And if two people claimed it, like Quintus and Sextus, well, that's when things got spicy. The argument between these two men got so heated that their entire units got involved. The legionaries' regular army infantry were backing Quintus, the Marines were backing Sextus, and it was escalating fast. We're talking about men who'd just survived a brutal siege, pumped full of adrenaline, armed, and now ready to fight each other over who deserved the crown. The historian Livy tells us it nearly came to blows. Soldiers who'd fought side by side hours earlier were now shouting, shoving, hands on sword hilts. The situation was about to spiral into a full-scale brawl between Roman units. That's when the commanding general stepped in. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. History knows him as Scipio Africanus, one of Rome's greatest military minds, and Scipio was smart. He could see this argument tearing his army apart, so he did something unusual. He appointed 3 judges, 3 neutral arbiters to investigate the claims, hear the testimony, and make a ruling. Think of it like a military tribunal, except instead of judging a crime, they're determining who deserves the greatest honor Rome can bestow. After reviewing the evidence, talking to witnesses, examining the timeline, probably giving themselves headaches trying to reconstruct the fog of battle, the judges came to a conclusion. Both men had entered the wall simultaneously. It was a tie, so Scipio awarded both men the Corona Moralis. Problem solved, right? Except, this decision reveals just how extraordinary this honor was, because giving 2 crowns wasn't the norm. The whole point of the Corona Moralis was its exclusivity. Scipio essentially broke the rules to prevent his army from tearing itself apart. That's how much these men wanted it. Now let me tell you why. What did winning this crown actually mean? First, let's talk about the immediate tangible reward. According to various Roman sources, recipients of the Corona Moralis received a substantial financial bonus. We're talking about an amount that could set up a common soldier for life. In a world where most soldiers earned barely enough to survive, this was generational wealth. But the money, honestly, was the least important part. The real value was in what happened next. Because when you won the Corona Moralis, you became famous. Not celebrity famous, hero famous. Your name got recorded in military records, announced in public ceremonies, carved into monuments. The general would call you forward in front of the entire army, praise your courage, and place that golden crown on your head, while thousands of soldiers cheered. Can you imagine that moment? You're a nobody. Maybe you grew up on a farm or in the slums of Rome. Your father was a nobody, his father was a nobody. Your entire bloodline has been, forgive the term, irrelevant to history. And then, in one terrifying climb up a ladder, you become somebody. But here's where it gets even better. This fame wasn't just for you, it was for your entire family. And in Roman society, that mattered more than almost anything. Let me tell you what happened to Quintus Trebellius's family, because it's a perfect example. Before Quintus climbed that wall, the Trebellius family was, well, they weren't in the history books. They existed, they paid taxes, they lived and died, but nobody was writing about them. They were average, forgettable. After Quintus won the Corona Moralis, the gens Trebellia, that's the formal name for his extended family clan, suddenly appears in Roman records. His descendants go on to hold important positions, military commands, government posts. And get this, In 55 AD, more than 250 years after Quintus's famous climb, a man named Marcus Trebellius Maximus from this same family becomes consul. Consul, that's one of the two highest elected positions in Rome, basically co-president. You don't get much more prestigious than that in ancient Rome. Now, I'm not saying Quintus's one act of bravery directly caused his distant descendant to become consul 250 years later. But it opened the door. It established the family name. It gave them legitimacy, connections, and a story to point to. Our ancestor was the first over the wall at New Carthage. We come from a line of heroes. In Roman society, where your family name was everything, this was priceless. And this wasn't unique to Quintus. Over and over you see this pattern. A common soldier wins the Corona Muralis, and suddenly his family trajectory changes. Doors open, marriage prospects improve, because who wouldn't want to marry into a family of heroes? Business opportunities appear, political allies take notice. There's a reason the Roman historian Livy wrote that soldiers dashed on in the face of wounds and missiles, and that neither walls nor armed men standing on them could restrain them from vying with one another in the attempt to climb. They weren't just being brave, they were competing. They wanted that crown. Here's something fascinating. The Romans didn't award the Corona Muralis posthumously. You had to survive to get it. This wasn't like modern militaries where medals can be awarded after death. No survival, no crown, period. This rule reveals something important about Roman values. They weren't celebrating martyrdom. They weren't glorifying suicide missions. They were rewarding success. Dangerous, audacious success. But success nonetheless. You had to be skilled enough, lucky enough, and tough enough to make it up that ladder, survive the defenders, and live to tell about it. The archaeological evidence shows just how rare this crown was. Researcher Valerie Maxfield, who studied Roman military decorations extensively, notes that we have records of only a handful of Corona Muralis recipients. In centuries of Roman military history, with thousands of sieges, we can name maybe a couple dozen recipients. That's it. Compare that to other Roman military honours: the hastapura, a ceremonial spear, the torques, neck rings, the phalarai, decorative discs. These were given out regularly. Lots of soldiers earned these, but the Corona Muralis, you were more likely to die trying to earn it than to actually receive it. And yet, soldiers still tried. That's the wild part. Knowing the odds, knowing the danger, they still climbed. There's a passage from Livy that's always stuck with me. He's describing Roman soldiers during a siege, and he writes, "They even competed against each other for the privilege, because everyone wanted to scale the defences and face the enemy first." Think about that phrase, competed for the privilege of probable death, the privilege of climbing into hell. That's how powerful the reward was. Now you might be wondering, did the soldiers who won this crown actually wear it around? Like, did Quintus walk around town with a golden crown on his head? Actually, kind of, yeah. Roman triumph ceremonies, victory parades, would feature decorated soldiers wearing their awards, and even in everyday life the Corona Muralis could be displayed in your home, worn at special events, and eventually passed down as a family heirloom. It was a permanent badge of honour, but more importantly the crown was immortalised in art. Wealthy Romans who'd won military honours would commission statues, mosaics and paintings, showing themselves wearing their decorations. Coins were minted bearing the image of the Corona Muralis. It became a symbol recognised throughout the empire. If you won it, everyone knew, and everyone knew what it meant. This person is either incredibly brave or incredibly lucky, and probably both. Here's what strikes me most about all this. The Romans understood something profound about human motivation. They knew that soldiers, especially soldiers from the lower classes, had limited paths to glory. You couldn't buy fame. You couldn't inherit it if your family had nothing, but you could earn it if you were willing to risk everything. The Corona Moralis was Rome's way of saying, we value courage so much that we'll transform your entire life for one moment of extraordinary bravery. And that promise, that possibility convinced men to do the seemingly impossible. Was it manipulative? Maybe. Was it exploitative? You could argue that, but it worked. For centuries it worked. And the legacy of this crown extended far beyond Rome. Because when Rome fell, the idea didn't die. Medieval kingdoms looked at this system and thought, we need something like that. They adapted it, changed it, gave it different names and different forms. But the core concept remained, risk everything and you might gain everything. Speaking of medieval adaptations, that's exactly where we're headed next. Because while the Roman Empire eventually collapsed, the idea of rewarding the first man over the wall, that survived. It evolved, and in medieval Europe it became something even more powerful, a pathway from peasant to knight, from nothing to nobility. The rules changed, the rewards changed, but the basic deal remained the same. Climb that ladder, survive, and watch your world transform. But the question we need to ask is, how did medieval societies adapt this Roman system? What did they offer their soldiers? And why did knights, actual knights with land and titles, still volunteer for these suicidal missions? Let's find out. When the Roman Empire crumbled, you'd think the whole volunteer to probably die for glory system would have died with it. After all, the legions were gone, the Corona Moralis melted down or lost to history, and Europe descended into what we politely call the Middle Ages. But here's the thing about good ideas, especially ideas about getting people to do dangerous things. They don't just disappear, they evolve. Medieval Europe took Rome's playbook and made it even more extreme. Because instead of offering a golden crown and some financial rewards, medieval lords started offering something far more powerful, the chance to completely escape your social class. They were offering knighthood, and if you know anything about medieval society, you know that's not just a promotion, that's a transformation of your entire existence. Let me paint you a picture of what life was like for a common soldier in, say, the 1100s. You're a peasant. Maybe you work your lord's land, or you're a craftsman in a town, or you've signed up as a foot soldier because the pay, while terrible, is still better than starving. Your life is predetermined. Your children will be peasants. Their children will be peasants. That's just how it works. Medieval society was rigidly stratified. Think of it like a pyramid cast in concrete. At the bottom you've got peasants and labourers. That's probably you. In the middle, merchants and craftsmen. Near the top, knights and minor nobility. At the very top, the great lords and kings. And the thing about this pyramid, you don't move up it. Ever. Well, almost never. 'Cause there was one crack in that concrete. One narrow, terrifying pathway from bottom to top, and it involved a ladder, a wall, and a willingness to die. Medieval chronicles, and I'm talking about actual historical documents from the period, contain numerous accounts of common soldiers being granted knighthood after being the first over an enemy wall. The pattern appears again and again across different kingdoms, different centuries, different sieges. Take the First Crusade, for instance, when Christian armies besieged cities like Antioch and Jerusalem in the late 1000s and early 1100s. The chroniclers specifically mention commanders promising knighthood to the first men over the walls. One account describes a foot soldier named, and this name is almost too perfect, Raimbold Croton, who scaled the walls of Jerusalem in 1099 and was immediately knighted on the field by his commanding duke. Think about what that meant for Raimbold. Yesterday he was a nobody. Today he's Sir Raimbold, with land rights, legal privileges, the right to bear arms, exemption from certain taxes, and most importantly status. His children would be born noble. His family name, previously meaningless, was now part of the aristocracy, all because he climbed a wall first. But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is something that always blows my mind about medieval society. Even knights, actual established knights, would still volunteer for these missions. You'd think, hey, you've already made it, why risk it? But they did. Constantly. Why would someone who already had status, land, and security risk it all on a siege ladder? The answer is more. They wanted more. See, knighthood wasn't just one thing, it had levels, like a video game character. You could be a landless knight, basically noble by title but poor. You could be a landed knight with a small estate. Or you could be a great lord with multiple properties and vassals of your own. And then there were titles: baron, earl, duke, each one representing more power, more wealth, more prestige. Medieval knights were ambitious. They'd grown up hearing stories, the chansons de geste, songs of heroic deeds, about legendary warriors who earned glory through impossible acts of courage. Roland, El Cid, Guillaume d'Orange. These weren't just entertainment, they were instruction manuals. They taught, this is how you rise, this is how you become legendary. And one of the most repeated themes in these tales, the first man over the wall becomes a hero. I found a fascinating account from the Siege of Acre during the Third Crusade in 1191. King Richard the Lionheart, that Richard, was besieging this coastal city. The siege had dragged on for months. Food was running low, morale was worse, and Richard needed a breakthrough. So he made an announcement. Substantial land grants to the first man over the wall. Not just knighthood, land. Real estate in the Holy Land, which at that time was basically winning the lottery. According to the chronicler, dozens of knights volunteered. Not peasants hoping for knighthood, actual knights hoping for more. The competition was fierce. Men who already had comfortable lives back in England or France were suddenly treating this like the opportunity of a lifetime. Several died in the attempt. The Muslim defenders of Acre were incredibly skilled and well prepared, but eventually an English knight made it over, secured a foothold, and the city fell. History doesn't record his name in most texts, which is frustrating, but it records that he got his reward. Land, wealth, and a place in the stories told about that crusade. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but medieval warfare was different from Roman warfare, right? Maybe the ladders weren't as dangerous? Oh, friend, no. If anything, medieval sieges were worse. Medieval defenders had learned all the Roman tricks and invented new ones. They had crossbows which could punch through chainmail at close range. They had better fortifications, thicker walls, cleverly designed angles that made ladders harder to place, machicolations, those cool jutting parts of castles you see in movies, specifically designed to rain death on climbers. Plus, medieval armies had developed something the Romans used less frequently: Greek fire's descendants. Various forms of incendiary weapons, basically early napalm, that could be poured or thrown onto attackers. I read one account from a 13th century siege where defenders heated sand mixed with lime until it was scorching, then poured it down. The lime would react with the moisture in people's eyes and skin, causing chemical burns on top of thermal burns. Medieval warfare was brutal, and yet, men still volunteered. Here's an account that really stuck with me. It comes from the chronicles of Jean Froissart, a medieval historian who documented the 100 Years' War between England and France. He describes a siege where a common foot soldier, just a regular guy from the infantry, made it over the wall first. The commanding knight, true to his word, immediately dismounted, gave the soldier his own sword, and performed the dubbing ceremony right there, on the battlements, with fighting still going on around them. The soldier who hours earlier had been marching in formation with the spear was now Sir whatever his name was. with all the rights and privileges thereof. Froissart writes that the other common soldiers cheered louder for this than for the victory itself, because it proved the possibility. It showed them, that could be me, that could be my way out. The economic reality of medieval knighthood can't be overstated. Being a knight wasn't just prestigious, it was profitable. Knights received income from their lands, they could collect taxes from peasants working that land, they had legal rights to demand labour and goods. A successful knight could live quite comfortably without ever working in the traditional sense. Compare that to a peasant's life, back-breaking labour, dawn to dusk, just to produce enough to survive and pay taxes to your lord. The gap between peasant and knight wasn't just social, it was economic. We're talking about the difference between subsistence and abundance. So when a lord offered knighthood to the first man over the wall, he was offering an economic transformation. Your children would never be hungry, your grandchildren would be educated, your family line would be secure. That's what was at the top of that ladder. Not just honour, financial freedom, but let's be honest about the dark side of this system because it existed. Medieval lords knew exactly what they were doing. They were dangling social mobility in front of desperate men to get them to perform near-suicidal tasks. Is that exploitation? I mean, kind of, yeah. But from the soldier's perspective, and this is important, it was opportunity. Horrifying, deadly opportunity, but opportunity nonetheless. In a world where social mobility was essentially impossible, where your birth determined everything, this was one of the only chances to change your destiny. And the thing is, it worked often enough to keep the dream alive. Not everyone who climbed first survived, obviously. Most didn't, but some did. And those success stories spread like wildfire. I imagine soldiers around campfires telling stories. You hear about Jacques? Made it over the wall at that siege last year. He's Sir Jacques now. Got a manor in Burgundy. His son's training to be a knight too. Stories like that would have been powerful motivation. There's a term in sociology, the lottery effect. It's when people overestimate their chances of success because they focus on the winners rather than the vast majority of losers. Medieval soldiers probably suffered from this. They heard about the handful who made it and underestimated the hundreds who died trying. But here's the thing. Even if they understood the odds, even if they knew it was a 1 in 100 chance, many would still take it. Because for a peasant in medieval Europe, those were pretty good odds. Your chances of escaping poverty through any other means? Essentially zero. At least climbing the ladder gave you a shot. The medieval period also gave us something the Romans didn't emphasize as much: the power of stories. Medieval society was obsessed with chivalric romances, tales of knights performing incredible deeds, and the first over-the-wall story became a standard trope. When minstrels sang at castles, when stories were told in taverns, the brave knight scaling the impossible wall was a recurring character. This wasn't just history, it was propaganda. It was recruitment material. It made young men dream of glory. And it worked. Generation after generation, soldiers climbed those ladders. By the 1300s and 1400s, the system was so established that military commanders could reliably count on having volunteers for ladder assaults. They didn't have to force anyone. Men would compete for the chance. That's how ingrained the reward system had become in military culture. But things were about to change. Because while medieval Europe was perfecting the art of rewarding suicidal bravery, technology was evolving. Gunpowder was spreading from China and the Islamic world into Europe. Cannons were getting more powerful and more common. And when you can blow a hole in a wall with artillery, the ladder becomes less necessary. The whole dynamic was about to shift. Still, even as warfare evolved, even as we moved from the medieval period into the early modern era, The core idea, volunteer for extreme danger, receive life-changing rewards that didn't disappear. It just got a new name, a new structure, and if anything, it became even more formalized and even more deadly. In the next part of our journey, we're jumping ahead a few centuries to meet a very specific type of soldier. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope, and that name tells you everything you need to know. These were organized suicide squads, official units with ranks and structures specifically designed to be the first through the breach. And the British military made it so attractive that men competed for these positions. We're going to meet the officers who led them, understand the precise rewards they received, and discover how this system reached its horrifying peak during the Napoleonic Wars. There's something darkly poetic about the British military's approach to this whole who wants to die first problem. Because by the time we get to the 1600s and 1700s, they'd stop pretending it was anything other than what it was. They gave it a name that was honest, brutal, and somehow still attracted volunteers. They called it the Forlorn Hope. Now, if you speak modern English, that phrase sounds depressing. Forlorn means lonely, abandoned, hopeless. And hope, in this context? Well, it's not the optimistic kind. Put them together and you get the hopeless abandonment, which is about as cheerful as it sounds. But here's where language gets interesting. The British didn't invent this phrase. They borrowed it and they misunderstood it, and that misunderstanding created something weirdly perfect. The original term was Dutch, verloren hoop. Now, verloren does translate to lost or forlorn, that part they got right. But hoop. In Dutch military terminology, hoop meant a troop formation, basically a squad or unit, so verloren hoop literally meant lost squad or expendable troop. But when English soldiers first heard Dutch mercenaries using this term in the 1500s, they heard hope instead of hoop. And they ran with it. The forlorn hope. The lost hopeless squad. The men who probably won't come back. It's accidentally the most honest military unit name in history. No glory, no heroic title, just this is probably going to end badly for you. And yet, men lined up to join it. Let me explain how this actually worked, because the British turned suicide volunteering into a system with ranks, regulations, and a clear promotional structure. It was organised desperation. When a British army was besieging a fortress and preparing for an assault, especially once artillery had blasted a breach in the walls, the commander would call for volunteers to form the Forlorn Hope. This was the unit that would go first, charging into the breach or scaling the walls ahead of everyone else. The structure was specific. The Forlorn Hope typically consisted of one officer, usually a lieutenant, though sometimes a captain, 2 or 3 sergeants, 2 or 3 corporals, around 20 to 30 regular soldiers, all volunteers, every single one. Now here's what made the British system particularly calculated. The rewards were standardized. It wasn't a vague promise of maybe you'll be rewarded. It was official military policy with guaranteed promotions. If you survived leading the Forlorn Hope, a lieutenant would instantly become a captain, a sergeant would become an ensign, the lowest officer rank. A corporal would become a sergeant regular. Soldiers would receive cash bonuses and first choice of plunder. These weren't suggestions. These were guaranteed. Put it in writing, sign it, done. If you lived, you moved up. The British had essentially gamified military suicide. They'd turned certain death into a career opportunity with clear, measurable outcomes. It's brilliant and horrifying in equal measure. But let's talk about why this system worked, because it reveals something fascinating about military culture in the 1700s and early 1800s. First, understand that military promotion in this era was normally purchased. If you wanted to become a captain in the British Army, you literally bought the commission. And we're not talking pocket change. A captaincy could cost several £1,000s, which in modern terms would be hundreds of thousands of dollars. For a poor lieutenant from a family with no money, that promotion was impossible. You'd stay a lieutenant your entire career, watching wealthy idiots buy their way past you simply because they had rich fathers. Unless you volunteered for the Forlorn Hope. Suddenly you had a path, a terrifying, probably fatal path, but a path nonetheless. You could earn in one assault what would otherwise cost a fortune. The military was offering you a way to bypass the class system entirely. This is why junior officers lined up to lead Forlorn Hopes. For them, it wasn't just about bravery, it was about opportunity. They were gambling their lives, sure, but the alternative was stagnation. Would you rather die trying to advance, or live forever stuck in a junior position, poor and overlooked? Many chose the first option. There's an account from a British officer in the Peninsular War. That's the campaign against Napoleon in Spain and Portugal, early 1800s, where he describes the moment the call went out for Forlorn Hope volunteers. He writes that officers pressed forward eagerly and that there was actual competition, with men arguing why they deserved the position more than their peers. Think about that. Arguing for the right to probably die. That's how valuable the reward was. For regular soldiers, the motivation was different but equally powerful. Most British soldiers in this era were poor. Many had joined the army to escape poverty, debt, or even prison. The army paid terribly, flogged you for minor infractions, and generally treated you as disposable. But if you survived a Forlorn Hope assault, you got cash, sometimes a lot of it, and you got first choice when the city was plundered, which, we need to be honest about this, was an expected part of siege warfare. After a city fell, especially after a hard fight, soldiers were often given a period of sanctioned looting. This sounds barbaric to modern ears, and it was. But in military terms, it served a purpose. It was deferred payment. We can't pay you well now, but if you win, you can take what you need from the conquered city. For a Forlorn Hope survivor, being first in line for plunder meant grabbing the valuable stuff before it was picked over. Gold, jewelry, food, wine, whatever wasn't nailed down. Some soldiers made small fortunes this way. Was it moral? No. Was it exploitative of both the soldiers and the conquered civilians? Absolutely. But it was the system, and it motivated men to volunteer for otherwise suicidal missions. There's another aspect to the Forlorn Hope that's worth understanding, the badge of honour that came with survival. In the British rifle regiments, particularly the famous 95th Rifles, men who'd survived Forlorn Hope assaults wore a special badge on their right sleeve, a laurel wreath with the letters VS embroidered inside. VS stood for Valiant Stormer. This wasn't just decoration, it was instant credibility. When other soldiers saw that badge, they knew, this man has been through hell and lived. He's proven himself in the absolute worst circumstances. He's not to be messed with. Veterans with VS badges commanded respect from both their peers and their superiors. In barracks, in pubs, wherever soldiers gathered, these men were legends. They had stories that other soldiers wanted to hear, advice that other soldiers needed, and a reputation that preceded them. There's an account of a sergeant named Fleming, I love that we have his name, who survived 3 separate Forlorn Hope assaults. 3. The man apparently had a gift for not dying. He wore 3 laurel badges on his sleeve, which must have looked absolutely ridiculous, but also made him possibly the most respected soldier in his regiment. Other soldiers would literally buy him drinks just to hear his stories. He was a living, walking miracle. But here's what's really interesting. Even with all these rewards, even with the guaranteed promotions and the badges and the glory, the British military rarely had to pressure anyone. They had enough volunteers. That tells us something. These men understood the odds. They weren't stupid. They'd seen previous Forlorn Hopes get chewed up. They knew the statistics, and they still raised their hands. Why? Because the alternative, staying poor, staying low-ranked, staying invisible, felt worse than risking death for a chance at something better. There's a quote from a British military historian named Ian Fletcher, who specialised in the Napoleonic Wars. He wrote, "The forlorn hope was the British Army's acknowledgement that some tasks required not just courage, but desperation. They needed men with nothing to lose and everything to gain. That's it exactly. The forlorn hope wasn't recruiting heroes, it was recruiting the desperate and the ambitious. Often, those were the same people." Now, I want to tell you about the naming conventions in other armies, because the British weren't alone in this. The French had their version, the Germans had theirs, and the names are equally telling. The French called their suicide squads les enfants perdus, the lost children. There's something especially dark about that name, isn't there? It sounds almost tender, like a fairy tale gone wrong. These lost children were guaranteed promotion to officer rank if they survived. France, like Britain, knew how to motivate desperate men. The German states used Der Verlorene Haufen, the lost troop, same concept, different language. These soldiers carried massive two-handed swords and were sent to hack through pike formations, which was essentially a death sentence with extra steps, across different cultures, different languages, different military traditions. The pattern was the same. Identify the most dangerous task, promise extraordinary rewards, and watch desperate men volunteer. It's almost like humanity discovered a formula for converting hope into sacrifice. One thing that's important to understand is that the forlorn hope wasn't always a ladder assault. By the 1700s and 1800s, siege warfare had evolved. Artillery, cannons, could blast breaches in walls, creating gaps in the fortifications. These breaches became the new focus of attacks, but breaches were, if anything, more dangerous than ladder assaults. Imagine a breach. It's basically a pile of rubble, at an awkward angle, creating a narrow passage through the wall. The defenders know exactly where you're coming from. There's no surprise, no alternate routes. They've had time to prepare the breach with obstacles, traps, and pre-positioned weapons, and they're shooting down at you while you're climbing up broken stone, slipping on rubble, exposed from multiple angles. The Forlorn Hope's job was to charge this breach first, absorb the initial, most intense defensive fire, and if any survived, establish a foothold that the main army could exploit. The casualty rates were staggering. In many assaults, the Forlorn Hope suffered 70%, 80%, even 90% casualties. That's not an exaggeration. Those are numbers from actual historical records of specific assaults. Let me put that in perspective. If 30 men charged, maybe 3 to 5 would survive uninjured. The rest would be dead or wounded, often horrifically. And the survivors knew this going in. They'd watched previous Forlorn Hopes get destroyed. They understood the odds. They went anyway. There's a cynical calculation underlying all of this, and the British military leadership understood it perfectly. They knew they didn't need the Forlorn Hope to actually succeed in taking the breach. They just needed them to go first, to trigger the traps, to make the defenders expend ammunition and reveal their positions. The Forlorn Hope was, in brutal military terms, a reconnaissance by death. Send in the volunteers, see what kills them, then adjust the main assault accordingly. Did the volunteers understand this? Probably. Did it change their minds? Apparently not, because they kept volunteering. I think there's something almost philosophical in that choice. These men looked at their lives, poor, constrained, without prospects, and decided that a tiny chance at glory was worth more than a long life of obscurity. Is that brave? Is that foolish? Is that tragic? Maybe it's all three. The British Army, to its credit, or maybe shame, kept accurate records. We have regimental histories that list Forlorn Hope assaults, who led them, and who survived. Reading through these records is eerie. You see names, ranks, outcomes. Lieutenant Morrison died of wounds. Sergeant Caldwell survived, promoted to ensign. Private Davies killed in the breach. Each entry represents a man who made a choice, who stood at the base of a breach or a wall and decided, "This is my shot." Sometimes I wonder if they regretted it in their final moments. Did Lieutenant Morrison, dying from the musket ball in the breach, think, "This was a mistake"? Or did he think, "At least I tried"? We can't know. But we know they kept volunteering. For decades, across hundreds of sieges, the Forlorn Hope never lacked for men willing to try. That's the power of the reward system. That's the power of offering people a path, any path, out of their circumstances. But all of this, everything we've talked about, is still abstract. We've covered the theory, the structure, the motivations. Now we need to see it in action. We need to witness an actual Forlorn Hope assault, see what happened when theory met reality, when desperate volunteers met prepared defenders. And for that, we're heading to Spain, to a fortress called Badajoz, to the night of April 6th, 1812, one of the bloodiest nights in British military history. We're going to follow the Forlorn Hope into that breach, and we're going to understand, finally, what all of this really cost. Not in abstract statistics, but in blood, terror, and bodies piling up in the dark. April 6th, 1812, Badajoz, Spain, 10 o'clock at night. If you were a British soldier standing in the darkness outside this fortress city, you could hear the silence before the storm. Around you, 27,000 Allied troops, British and Portuguese, were preparing for what everyone knew would be a slaughter. Ahead of you, behind massive stone walls, 5,000 French soldiers waited with loaded muskets, sharpened bayonets, and weeks of preparation. And somewhere in that mass of soldiers, scattered among different regiments, were the volunteers, the men who'd raised their hands, the Forlorn Hope. Tonight, we're going to follow them into hell. But first, let me set the scene, because you need to understand what Badajoz meant strategically. This wasn't just another siege. This was the key to the entire Peninsular War. Picture the Iberian Peninsula, like a gate between Portugal and Spain. Badajoz was one of the locks on that gate. As long as France held it, they could use it as a base to invade Portugal. As long as France held it, British Commander Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, couldn't safely advance deeper into Spain. Badajoz had to fall. Wellington knew it, the French knew it, and everyone knew it wouldn't be easy. The fortress was formidable. We're talking about walls 30 feet high, 8 feet thick at their thinnest point, studded with bastions, those angular projecting sections that gave defenders overlapping fields of fire. The city had already survived 2 British sieges in 1811. Both times the British had failed and retreated with heavy losses. This was the 3rd attempt, and Wellington was running out of time. See, intelligence reported that French Marshal Soult was marching with a relief army. If he arrived before Badajoz fell, Wellington would be trapped between the garrison inside the city and Soult's forces outside. That's a military nightmare. You become the besieged. So Wellington ordered an assault before his own siege preparations were complete. The breaches in the wall weren't quite wide enough. The approach wasn't fully cleared, and the defenders had been given extra time to prepare traps. Everything about this assault violated the careful, methodical rules of siege warfare. But time was running out, so they attacked anyway. The plan was actually clever, classic Wellington. While the main assault hit 3 breaches in the eastern walls, 2 diversionary attacks would hit the castle in the north and the San Vicente bastion in the west. Split the French defenders, divide their attention, hopefully break through somewhere. The Forlorn Hopes were assigned to each main breach. 3 separate suicide squads, each with roughly 30 volunteers, all attacking simultaneously at 10 p.m. Let me tell you about one of these officers, because we actually know his name, which is rare enough to be worth remembering. Lieutenant Whitelaw of the 88th Regiment of Foot, the famous Connaught Rangers, an Irish unit with a reputation for toughness. Whitelaw volunteered to lead the Forlorn Hope attacking the castle. He was young. The records don't give his exact age, but most lieutenants were in their early 20s. Maybe he had debts, maybe he had ambitions, maybe he just wanted his name in the history books. We don't know his thoughts, we only know his choice. He led his men forward with ladders at 10 p.m. just as planned, and within minutes he was mortally wounded. That's all the historical record tells us. Mortally wounded. No dramatic last words, no heroic death scene. Just he went forward, got hit and died. His forlorn hope was shattered, scattered, failing to make any progress. The main breaches were worse. Wellington's engineers had reported the breaches practicable. Military speak for wide enough to attack through. But practicable doesn't mean safe, and it doesn't mean undefended. The French commander, General Armand Philippon, remember that name because he was brilliant, had spent the day preparing. He knew the attack was coming. He'd watched the British siege guns fall silent at 7:30 p.m, the usual sign that an assault was imminent. So while the British soldiers ate their rations and prepared mentally for the attack, French engineers were busy turning the breaches into death traps. They planted chevaux de frise, basically frames covered in sword blades pointing outward like massive deadly hedgehogs. These things were designed to stop cavalry charges, but they work just as well on infantry. Try to push through one in the dark and you're getting impaled on multiple blades simultaneously. They scattered caltrops, 4-pointed metal spikes. No matter how they landed, one spike always pointed up. Step on one and it goes through your boot, through your foot, straight into bone. Now you're on the ground, screaming, and the men behind you are tripping over you. They prepared barrels of gunpowder with the short fuses. Not cannons, these were improvised bombs positioned in the breaches. When British soldiers entered, French defenders would light the fuses and roll these barrels into the attackers. The explosions would kill or maim anyone within 15 feet, and they prepared incendiaries. Bales of hay soaked in pitch, ready to be lit and thrown. Not to kill, well, not directly, but to provide light, because the British were attacking at night, hoping darkness would provide some cover. The French turned that darkness into flickering hellish illumination, with burning hay casting shadows while soldiers died. At 10 p.m. the assault began. The British soldiers advanced in silence. Orders were to maintain quiet until they hit the breaches, then storm through with bayonets. No firing muskets, just cold steel and momentum. They covered the open ground, hauling scaling ladders, carrying bundles of hay to throw into the ditches at the wall's base. The French sentries spotted them quickly. You can't hide 27,000 men and raise the alarm. Within seconds the walls erupted with fire. Musket volleys from the ramparts, cannon fire from the bastions. The carefully maintained silence shattered into chaos. Screaming orders, screaming wounded, the continuous crackling of musketry like deadly applause. The forlorn hopes reached the breaches first. That was their job. Charge in, absorb the initial fire, create an opening. What they found was a nightmare made real. The breaches weren't clean slopes. They were piles of rubble at steep angles, unstable footing with obstacles hidden in the darkness. And at the top, French infantry in prepared positions, firing down into the mass of British soldiers. One British officer, a captain named Harry Smith who survived the night, later wrote, "The scene was dreadful. From the ramparts above, they poured down showers of shot, shell, hand grenades and fireballs. The ditch was filled with men struggling to climb, trampling over the wounded, slipping on blood. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's what happens when hundreds of men try to force through a narrow breach under concentrated fire in the dark. The forlorn hopes were devastated within minutes. Of the 3 squads attacking the main breaches, almost none survived the first 10 minutes. The officers leading them, those lieutenants hoping for promotion to captain, mostly died. The sergeants hoping for commissions, dead. The regular soldiers hoping for bonuses, dead. But here's the horrific thing. Even as the forlorn hopes were being destroyed, more soldiers kept coming. That was the plan. The forlorn hope wasn't meant to succeed. It was meant to be the first wave. The second wave would follow immediately, then a third, then a fourth. Wave after wave of British and Portuguese soldiers charged those breaches for 2 hours, and for 2 hours they died. The French had positioned their best troops at the breaches, veterans who'd seen action across Europe, men who knew their business. They maintained a steady, disciplined rate of fire. Reload, aim, fire, reload, aim, fire. Like a machine harvesting lives. When attackers got close, the French would light fuses on those gunpowder barrels and roll them into the breaches. The explosions were devastating. Not just the immediate blast, but the way they caused rock slides of rubble, burying wounded men alive. The burning hay bales served their purpose perfectly. They created enough light that French soldiers could see their targets clearly while British attackers were silhouetted against the flames. It was like shooting at a firing range, except the targets were your fellow human beings. Within an hour, the breaches were literally clogged with bodies. Dead, dying, wounded. So many that soldiers climbing couldn't find footing on stone anymore. They were walking on corpses, slipping on blood. The wounded who couldn't move were being trampled by the next wave. One survivor described the sound as the worst part. Thousands of men in a confined space. The screaming wounded, the shouting officers trying to maintain order, the constant musket fire echoing off stone walls, the explosions, the crackling flames. It was sensory overload, hell made audible. And still, the British kept attacking. This is what's so horrifying about military discipline. These soldiers could see the breaches were death traps. They could see previous waves getting slaughtered. Logic said, don't go in there. Survival instinct screamed, run away. But orders said, attack. And generations of training, discipline, fear of punishment, and yes, hope for reward kept them moving forward. Wellington himself was watching from a nearby hill. According to witnesses, he was visibly distressed. This wasn't going according to plan. The breaches should have fallen in the first 30 minutes, an hour at most. But 2 hours in, his army was being bled dry, and the French still held the walls. He later wrote in a letter, "The storming of Badajoz affords as strong an instance of the gallantry of our troops as has ever been displayed, but I greatly hope that I shall never again be the instrument of putting them to such a test." That's about as close as Wellington, a man not known for emotional displays, ever came to saying, "That was too much. I asked too much of them." The casualties were staggering. In just those 2 hours attacking the main breaches, the British lost approximately 3,000 men killed or wounded. 3,000 in 2 hours at 3 breaches. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 1 man killed or wounded every 2 seconds continuously for 2 hours. The breaches never fell, but here's the twist. Badajoz did fall, just not where Wellington expected. Remember those diversionary attacks, the ones at the castle and San Vicente Bastion, meant just to distract French defenders? Those succeeded. At the castle, British troops with scaling ladders managed to get over the walls. The defences there were lighter. The French had concentrated forces at the main breaches because that's where they expected the real attack. Once British soldiers got over the castle walls, they opened gates from the inside. At San Vicente, a similar breakthrough. Portuguese troops found a section of wall that was damaged but not fully breached, climbed it with ladders, and established a foothold. By midnight, British and Portuguese forces were inside Badajoz, coming at the French defenders from behind. The French, realizing they were surrounded, surrendered. Badajoz had fallen. Wellington had his victory, but the cost was almost unbearable. When dawn came and the survivors could finally see the breaches clearly, the sight apparently made grown men weep. One officer wrote, "The ditches were so filled with our dead and wounded that you could walk across without touching the ground." That's not hyperbole, that's literal. The bodies were piled that deep. The final casualty count for the assault: 4,800 Allied soldiers killed or wounded in one night. In one relatively small fortress city. That's more casualties than many entire battles of the era. And here's something that often gets left out of the history books, but we need to talk about it. What happened next? After a siege, especially a bloody one, there was an unwritten rule. If a garrison forced attackers to storm the walls instead of surrendering, the attacking army was allowed a period of sack. Basically, sanctioned chaos where soldiers could loot the city. This was partly practical, deferred payment for soldiers, and partly punitive, to encourage future garrisons to surrender rather than resist. But at Badajoz it went far beyond looting. For 3 days, British soldiers ran wild through the city. They broke into homes and shops, stealing everything of value. They broke into wine cellars and got catastrophically drunk. And in their drunkenness and rage at what they'd just endured, rage at their dead friends, rage at everything, they committed atrocities against civilians, assaults, murders, destruction for its own sake. Officers tried to restore order, but soldiers, some of them still drunk, threatened their own officers. Some soldiers were shot by their officers while trying to restore discipline. It took Wellington personally riding into the city and ordering mass floggings, public whippings, to finally bring his army back under control. This is the ugly side of military glory, and we can't ignore it. These same men who'd shown incredible courage charging those breaches, who'd climbed over their dead friends to keep attacking, also committed horrible crimes against innocent people. Were they monsters? Or were they broken men, psychologically shattered by what they'd experienced, acting out trauma in the worst possible ways? I don't have an answer. Maybe both. Maybe trauma explains but doesn't excuse. History's complicated, and people are complicated, and sometimes the heroes and the villains are the same individuals on different days. But focusing back on the Forlorn Hope specifically, the volunteers who started this whole nightmare assault, their story is particularly tragic. Most died. The promised promotions, mostly unclaimed because the recipients were dead. The glory, they were barely mentioned in dispatches because their attacks failed. Their families got letters saying killed in action, and maybe a small pension, but nothing close to what had been promised if they'd survived. The survivors, and there were some, somehow, did get their promotions. The record shows several sergeants commissioned as ensigns after Badajoz, proof that the British Army kept its word to those few who lived. But was it worth it? For every sergeant who became an officer, 10 died trying. For every lieutenant who achieved his captaincy, 5 were buried in mass graves outside Badajoz's walls. That's the brutal mathematics of the Forlorn Hope system. It worked, in a cold military sense. It got desperate men to do impossible things, but the human cost was staggering. And this is what I keep coming back to. Those men at the breaches, in their final moments, what were they thinking? Did they regret volunteering? Did they curse Wellington for sending them? Did they think about the promotion they'd never receive? Or were they just terrified, in pain, wanting it to be over? We can't know, but we know they kept volunteering. Because after Badajoz, the British Army had more sieges, more assaults, more forlorn hopes, and men still raised their hands, that tells us something about human nature, about hope, about desperation. Even after Badajoz became legendary for its horror, and trust me, every soldier in Wellington's army knew what happened there, men still volunteered for the next forlorn hope. Because the alternative, staying poor, staying invisible, staying stuck, still felt worse than risking everything. That's the power of the system. That's why it worked for so long. But now we need to step back from the blood and chaos of that April night and ask bigger questions. Why did men really volunteer? What was happening psychologically? Because yes, rewards matter, but there's something deeper going on when someone looks at near certain death and says yes. In our next section, we're diving into the minds of these volunteers. We're going to explore the psychology of the first man up, the peculiar cocktail of youth, invincibility, honor culture, and peer pressure that made impossible choices seem reasonable. We're going to understand not just what they were fighting for, but how they convinced themselves they'd survive. You know what's fascinating? If you'd sat down with one of those Forlorn Hope volunteers the night before Badajoz and asked him, "Do you think you're going to die tomorrow?" he probably would have said no, not "I hope not," not "I'll try not to." But genuinely in his heart of hearts, he likely believed he'd be one of the survivors, despite knowing the statistics, despite seeing previous Forlorn Hopes get massacred, despite every logical indicator screaming that he was volunteering for death. He thought he'd make it. This isn't stupidity. This is human psychology doing what it does best, lying to us to keep us functional. And understanding this psychology, this weird cocktail of delusion and courage that makes men volunteer for suicide missions, tells us something profound about how humans work. Let's start with the most obvious factor: youth. Most soldiers who volunteered for Forlorn Hopes, especially in the Roman and medieval periods, were young, teens and 20s, overwhelmingly. And young people have a very specific relationship with mortality. They don't really believe in it. I'm not saying young people think they're literally immortal. They know intellectually that death exists, but there's a massive gap between intellectual knowledge and emotional belief. Ask any 20-year-old if they'll die someday, they'll say yes. Ask them if they'll die this year, they'll laugh at you. Psychologists call this the personal fable, the belief that you're somehow special, different, that the rules don't apply to you the same way they apply to everyone else. It's strongest in adolescence and young adulthood, and it's why young people take risks that older people wouldn't dream of. Think about it. Who's doing extreme sports? Mostly 20-somethings. Who's joining the military and volunteering for dangerous missions? Mostly 20-somethings. Who's driving too fast, drinking too much, making spectacularly bad decisions? You get the idea. There's actually a neurological basis for this. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for risk assessment, long-term planning, and thinking through consequences, doesn't fully develop until your mid-20s. So when an 18-year-old volunteer looks at a siege ladder and thinks, "I can do this," his brain literally isn't equipped to fully process the danger, which, from a military perspective, is perfect. Armies have always known this, even before neuroscience existed. They want young soldiers precisely because young soldiers believe they'll survive. Older soldiers have seen too much, know too much, and are way harder to convince to do suicidal things. But youth alone doesn't explain it, because plenty of young soldiers didn't volunteer. Plenty looked at that ladder and said, "Absolutely not, find someone else." So what separated the volunteers from everyone else? One major factor: honor culture. In ancient Rome, medieval Europe, and really most pre-modern societies, honor wasn't just a nice to have, it was everything. Your honor was your identity, your reputation, your social standing, all rolled into one. And in military societies especially, honor was directly tied to courage. The Romans had a concept they called virtues. It gets translated as virtue, but that's misleading to modern ears. Virtues didn't mean being morally good. It meant exhibiting the qualities of an ideal man: courage, strength, excellence in battle. It literally comes from vir, meaning man. A Roman soldier with virtues was admired, respected, held up as an example. Soldier without it? He was nothing. Worse than nothing, he was contemptible. The worst insult you could level at a Roman soldier was to question his courage. So when the call went out for volunteers to climb the wall first, there was enormous social pressure to step forward. Because refusing, staying back while others volunteered, that could be seen as cowardice. And cowardice was shameful in a way that death wasn't. This is hard for modern Western audiences to fully grasp because our culture has moved away from honor-based systems toward dignity-based systems. We believe everyone has inherent worth regardless of their actions. But in honor cultures, your worth is entirely dependent on your reputation, which is entirely dependent on your actions, especially your courage. Medieval knights understood this viscerally. The chivalric code wasn't just about protecting ladies and fighting fair, it was about proving your courage constantly. Knights who backed down from challenges, who showed fear, who refused dangerous missions. They were mocked, ostracized, sometimes even stripped of their knighthood. There's a medieval text, I believe it's from the 13th century Romance of the Rose, that says something like, "Better to die gloriously in battle than to live long in shame." That's not poetic exaggeration. That was how knights actually thought. So when a medieval lord asked for volunteers to climb the siege ladder first, knights were often competing for the position, because refusing would damage their reputation more than dying would. Think about that for a second. In their value system, death was preferable to being thought a coward. The social punishment for cowardice was worse than the physical punishment of potential death. Wild, right? But there's another layer to this, peer pressure. And I don't mean peer pressure in the high school everyone's doing it sense. I mean the deep psychological need to maintain standing within your group, especially your military unit. Military historians have long known that soldiers don't primarily fight for abstract concepts like country or freedom. They fight for their buddies, the men in their unit, their brothers in arms. That bond is incredibly powerful, and it creates a situation where soldiers would rather risk death than let down their friends. There's research on this from World War II. American military sociologists interviewed thousands of combat soldiers, and you know what they found? The primary motivation for most soldiers wasn't patriotism or hatred of the enemy. It was, I didn't want to let my unit down. I didn't want my buddies to think I was a coward. This dynamic was even stronger in ancient and medieval armies, where units often came from the same town or region. These weren't just fellow soldiers, they were neighbours, relatives, people you'd known your whole life. The shame of cowardice wouldn't just follow you in the army, it would follow you home, to your village, to your family. So when volunteers were called for, soldiers were often making a calculation. What will my friends think if I don't volunteer? What will people back home say? Can I live with that judgment? For many, the answer was no. Social death felt worse than actual death. Here's something that might sound counterintuitive. Group cohesion made suicidal missions more likely, not less. The stronger the bonds within a unit, the more willing individual soldiers were to take extreme risks. Why? Because strong group bonds create a situation where your identity becomes tied up with the group. You stop thinking of yourself as just John Smith, and start thinking of yourself as John Smith of the 95th Rifles, or John Smith, member of Caesar's 10th Legion. Your unit becomes part of who you are. And when the group needs volunteers, when the group is watching, when your identity is wrapped up in being part of this elite unit, you volunteer. because not volunteering would mean failing your identity, failing who you are. Modern militaries understand this completely. That's why they focus so heavily on unit cohesion, shared identity, esprit de corps. They know that soldiers with strong unit bonds will do almost anything to maintain their standing within that group. Now, let's talk about a factor that's less noble but probably just as important: optimism bias. Humans are terrible at assessing risk accurately. We consistently overestimate our chances of success and underestimate danger, especially when we have some element of control or skill involved. Psychologists have tested this extensively. Ask people to rate themselves as drivers, and about 80% will say they're above average. That's mathematically impossible. That's not how averages work. But we all think we're better than average because we focus on our own skills and knowledge while underestimating everyone else's. Now apply that to military situations. A soldier thinking about volunteering for the forlorn hope isn't thinking, well, statistically 80% of us will die, so I'm probably doomed. He's thinking, yes, it's dangerous, but I'm stronger/faster/smarter/more experienced than most. I'll be in that 20% who survive. This is especially true if the soldier has survived previous battles. Each survival reinforces the belief, I made it through that, I'll make it through this. They're building a narrative where they're special, lucky, skilled enough to beat the odds. There's even a name for this in psychology, the illusion of control. When people believe their skill or actions can influence outcomes, even in situations that are largely random, they take more risks. A soldier believes his training, his reflexes, his combat experience give him an edge. Maybe they do, marginally, but not enough to overcome 80% casualty rates. But the brain doesn't do that math. The brain says, I have skills, therefore I have a chance. And honestly, this optimism bias is probably adaptive from an evolutionary perspective. If our ancestors had been realistic about danger, they'd have never left the cave. Sometimes delusion is what gets us to do difficult, necessary things. Which brings me to another critical factor, the availability heuristic. This is the tendency to judge probability based on how easily examples come to mind. If you can easily remember instances of something happening, you assume it's more common than it is. For Forlorn Hope volunteers, they'd heard stories about survivors. They'd maybe met a sergeant with the VS badge, heard him tell his tales. These success stories were vivid, memorable, impressive. They stuck in your mind. What you didn't see, what wasn't memorable, was the hundreds of dead men who didn't get badges or promotions or stories. Dead men don't hang around the barracks telling tales. They're buried and largely forgotten. So the available examples, the ones that came easily to mind, were disproportionately success stories. This created a skewed sense of the actual odds. It's like lottery tickets. People who win the lottery get news coverage, celebrations, their story told widely. People who lose just throw away their ticket and are never heard from. So even though the odds of winning are astronomically low, the lottery seems more winnable than it is because winners are so visible. Forlorn Hope survivors were like lottery winners, highly visible, frequently discussed, creating an illusion that survival was more common than reality. Let me throw in something that might seem odd. Boredom. Sieges were incredibly boring. Not at the end, obviously, but the weeks or months leading up to an assault. Monumentally dull. Soldiers would sit in camps doing the same tedious routines day after day with nothing to do but think and wait. There's a phenomenon in psychology where prolonged boredom makes people crave stimulation, even risky stimulation. It's why people in boring jobs sometimes do reckless things, not because they want danger, but because they want to feel something. For soldiers trapped in a siege for weeks, the assault represented a break from monotony. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also exciting, meaningful, a chance to do something rather than just wait. I think this is part of why men volunteered. The alternative, sitting in camp feeling useless, being bored out of your mind, felt intolerable. At least charging the breach meant you were doing something, participating in history, being active rather than passive. There's also something we need to discuss that's less psychological and more philosophical, the concept of glory. In ancient and medieval societies, glory was a form of immortality. You couldn't live forever in body, but you could live forever in story, in reputation, in the memories of those who came after. The Romans talked about fama, fame, reputation that outlasts death. A soldier who won the Corona Muralis didn't just get a golden crown. He got his name recorded in histories, told in stories, potentially remembered for centuries. And isn't that a form of immortality? We're sitting here thousands of years later talking about Quintus Trebellius and Sextus Digitus. They achieved their immortality. Most Romans are forgotten, these men are remembered. For a young soldier from a nobody family facing a life of anonymity, the chance to be remembered forever. That's powerful motivation. Even if you die in the attempt, if you die gloriously, you live on in story. There's a line from Homer's Iliad, probably the most influential text on military honor in Western civilization, where Achilles is given a choice: live a long, peaceful life and be forgotten, or die young in battle and be remembered forever. Achilles chose glory, and every soldier who grew up hearing that story learned the lesson. Fame after death beats anonymity in life. Now here's something that makes me pause. Were these men brave, or were they foolish? The modern mind wants to put these in separate categories. Bravery is good, foolishness is bad. But I think these volunteers existed in a grey area between the two. They were brave. You can't deny that charging into near certain death requires courage. But they were also, in some sense, foolish. They overestimated their chances, underestimated danger, and made decisions that objectively weren't in their best interest. Maybe true courage is always a bit foolish. Maybe you have to be somewhat delusional to do genuinely brave things, because realistic people don't charge into machine gun fire or climb siege ladders. There's a quote. I can't remember who said it. Maybe it was just wisdom passed down through military culture. That goes, bravery is just stupidity that worked out. There's truth in that. The difference between a hero and a fool is often just luck. Same action, different outcome. But here's what I keep coming back to. These men made choices. They weren't drafted into the forlorn hope. They volunteered. With all the psychological factors we've discussed, with all the social pressure and optimism bias and honor culture, they still had to raise their hand. That moment of choice is worth respecting, even if we question the wisdom of it, and understanding the psychology behind it, the youth, the honor culture, the peer pressure, the cognitive biases, doesn't diminish these men. It makes them more human. They weren't supermen without fear. They were regular people with the same broken risk assessment software all humans have, trying to make the best choice they could with the information and values they had. They were flawed, hopeful, ambitious, scared and brave all at once, just like most of us, trying to navigate impossible situations. But all this psychology, all this internal mental calculation, existed within a specific tactical reality. Because volunteers didn't just throw themselves at walls randomly. There were strategies, techniques, specific methods that gave some men better chances of survival than others. And understanding those tactics, understanding the actual mechanics of how you might survive a ladder assault, brings us back to the practical, physical world of siege warfare. Here's a question that might seem obvious but is actually critical. Why did armies even use this system? Why not just order regular troops to attack? Why create specialized suicide squads at all? The answer reveals something important about military strategy. Sometimes, you need people willing to die first, not because you're cruel, but because it's the only way to save everyone else. Let me show you what I mean through a specific example, because abstract tactics are boring. Let's go back to that siege of New Carthage in 209 BC that we talked about earlier, the one where Quintus and Sextus argued over who got the corona moralis. When General Scipio arrived outside New Carthage with his Roman army, he had a problem. Actually, he had multiple problems, but one was overwhelming: time. His intelligence, and the Romans had surprisingly good intelligence networks, told him that 3 separate Carthaginian armies were spread across Spain. None of them were currently near New Carthage, but if they learned about his attack and united to relieve the city, Scipio would be massively outnumbered. His entire army could be destroyed. So Scipio calculated. He had less than 1 week. 7 days to take a fortified city that could, under normal circumstances, hold out for months. This wasn't a preference. This wasn't, it would be nice to win quickly. This was existential. If he didn't take the city within a week, he'd have to retreat or risk annihilation. And retreating after a failed siege would have been a political and military disaster that could have ended Rome's campaign in Spain. 7 days. That's the deadline. Now, how do you take a fortified city in 7 days? You can't starve them out. That takes months. You can't really tunnel under the walls in that time frame. You need a direct assault, and you need it to work immediately. This is where the first man up becomes militarily necessary, not just psychologically useful. Here's the brutal reality of siege warfare. The first assault is always the bloodiest. The defenders are fresh, fully supplied with ammunition, organized and in prepared positions. They have every advantage, and someone has to go first to absorb that initial devastating fire. Think of it like this. Imagine a machine gun nest in a pillbox. The first soldiers charging that position are going to die. That's just reality. But their attack forces the defenders to reveal their positions, expend ammunition, and focus their fire. The second wave coming immediately after has better information and a slightly better chance. The third wave even better. The first wave is essentially tactical reconnaissance, except the reconnaissance is done by dying and showing everyone else where the danger is. That sounds cold. It is cold. That's the calculation military commanders were making. Scipio needed men willing to go first, knowing they'd probably die, so that subsequent waves could exploit any opening they created. And to get those men, he needed to offer something extraordinary, hence the corona moralis. But there's another layer to this that's less obvious, the speed factor. In siege warfare, time doesn't just matter strategically, it matters tactically, moment by moment. The longer an assault takes, the more time defenders have to adjust, reinforce weak points, and organize counterattacks. A quick, violent assault that punches through in the first wave can succeed, where a slow, careful advance would fail. It's the difference between breaking a door down with one powerful kick versus slowly pushing against it. The first approach is more dangerous for the kicker, but it's also more likely to work. Military historians call this shock action, the psychological and physical impact of a sudden, overwhelming assault. And shock action requires people willing to charge immediately without hesitation into the most dangerous positions. That's what the first man up provided. The willingness to move fast, to attack immediately, to not hesitate even when logic screamed to stop. Let me give you another example from a completely different era. The Duke of Wellington, yes, him again, used escalade, that's the fancy term for ladder assaults, multiple times during his career, even though he hated sieges. Why? Because Wellington understood something fundamental. Every day you spend besieging a city costs money, supplies, and time. Your army is vulnerable while it's stationary. Disease spreads, morale drops, enemy relief forces might arrive. Sometimes, a quick ladder assault, even with its horrific casualties, was the lesser evil compared to a protracted siege that could take months. There's a recorded incident where Wellington took a city in India. I believe it was during the Second Anglo-Maratha War in the early 1800s, using just 4 ladders. 4. Not dozens, not hundreds. 4 ladders. The assault was incredibly risky. The casualties were severe. But the city fell in hours rather than weeks, and Wellington's army could move on to the next objective. From a strategic perspective, those casualties were worth it because they saved time and prevented larger losses later. I want to be clear. I'm not saying this was moral or good. I'm explaining the military logic. Commanders weren't sadists, well, mostly. They were making cold calculations about acceptable losses versus strategic benefits. And the soldiers who volunteered to go first, they were the essential variable in that equation. Without them, the whole strategy collapsed. Here's something fascinating about the tactical necessity of first men. It created a weird prisoner's dilemma situation. If nobody volunteered, the army was stuck. The commander couldn't order someone to be first. That would cause mutiny and destroy morale. But if the siege dragged on, everyone was at risk from disease, starvation, or enemy reinforcements. So it was actually in everyone's interest for someone to volunteer, even though it was against each individual's interest to be that someone. This is classic game theory stuff. The group benefits from individual sacrifice, but no individual wants to be the sacrifice. The reward system, chronicles, knighthood, forlorn hope promotions, solved this dilemma by making individual sacrifice personally beneficial. Genius, really. Evil genius, maybe, but genius nonetheless. Now let's talk about the opening the gates problem, because this is where first men became absolutely critical. Most fortified cities didn't just have walls, they had gates, massive heavy doors that were the main entry points. These gates were obviously the weakest points, so they were heavily defended. Walls of stone, reinforced doors, murder holes above where defenders could shoot down, sometimes multiple layers of gates creating a kill zone. Frontal assaults on gates were suicide. Everyone knew this. So how did you get in? You went over the wall somewhere else, reached the gates from inside, and opened them. This is why the first man over the wall was so valuable militarily. If he could survive long enough to get to the gate mechanisms and open them, he just allowed thousands of troops to flood in through a proper entrance instead of climbing ladders one at a time. One man, opening one gate, could determine the outcome of an entire siege. At New Carthage, this is exactly what happened. Scipio's 500 elite soldiers climbed the wall on the less defended north side using the lagoon tide, clever tactical planning, got inside and opened the east gate. Once that gate was open, thousands of Roman soldiers poured through, and the city's fate was sealed. Those 500 soldiers, especially the first ones over the wall, saved the lives of countless Romans who would have died trying to assault the main defences. They made the siege winnable. From Scipio's perspective, offering the Corona Moralis to motivate those first climbers was the best investment he could make. One golden crown, some financial rewards, and fame for a few men in exchange for potentially thousands of lives saved and a critical strategic victory. That's the tactical necessity in its purest form. But here's where it gets morally complex. Because yes, these volunteers saved other soldiers' lives, but they were also being exploited. The commanders knew the odds. They knew most volunteers would die, and they still encouraged it, rewarded it, celebrated it. Were they evil for doing this? Or were they just doing their jobs, trying to win wars with the tools available? I genuinely don't know. Maybe both. There's a concept in military ethics called the doctrine of double effect. It says an action that causes harm can be moral if 1. The action itself is good or neutral. 2. The good effect isn't achieved through the bad effect. And 3. The good effect outweighs the bad effect. Does sending volunteers to probable death to save other soldiers fit this doctrine? The action, military assault, is arguably neutral. The good effect, winning the siege, doesn't require the volunteers to die specifically, just to attempt the assault. And maybe saving thousands of soldiers outweighs losing dozens of volunteers. But man, that's a cold calculation when you're talking about real humans with families and futures. Let me tell you about a different kind of tactical necessity, the psychological effect on defenders. When defenders saw attackers willing to charge directly into death, it had a powerful psychological impact. It told them, these attackers are committed. They're not going to give up. They're willing to die to take this city. That's terrifying to defend against. It's one thing to face a cautious, careful enemy who'll retreat when things get too dangerous. It's another thing to face fanatics or people motivated to look like fanatics who keep coming no matter how many you kill. There are accounts from various sieges, I'm thinking particularly of the Crusades, where defenders, seeing wave after wave of attackers climbing ladders despite horrific casualties, simply lost hope. They concluded, we can't stop these people. They're going to keep coming until they win or they're all dead. That demoralization could cause defenders to surrender earlier, saving lives on both sides. So the first man up wasn't just tactically necessary for opening gates or creating breaches. He was psychologically necessary for breaking the defender's will. Dark? Yes. Effective? Also, yes. Here's another angle on tactical necessity that's less obvious. The survivors became invaluable military assets. Think about it. A soldier who'd been first over a wall, survived, and helped capture a city had learned lessons you can't teach in training. He knew what worked, what didn't, what mistakes to avoid, how to read a siege situation. These survivors became informal advisors and trainers. They'd tell younger soldiers, when you're climbing, keep your shield at this angle. When you reach the top, do this immediately. Watch for that. Their experience saved lives in future sieges. So even though most volunteers died, the few survivors created a multiplier effect, improving the overall success rate of future assaults. From a military perspective, this made the system sustainable. You weren't just sacrificing men for short-term gains. You were creating a body of expertise that benefited the entire army long-term. Cynical? Absolutely, but effective. Now, I want to address something we haven't talked about yet. Alternative strategies. You might be thinking, surely there were better ways to take cities than sending men up ladders. And yes, there were. Siege towers, tunneling, artillery, starvation, all of these existed and were used. But each had problems. Siege towers were expensive, time-consuming to build, and could be burned. Tunneling took weeks or months and required skilled engineers. Artillery, before gunpowder, couldn't really breach thick stone walls. Starvation took forever and risked disease in your own camp. Ladders were cheap, fast, and required no special expertise. Any carpenter could make one. So despite the horrific casualties, ladder assaults kept being used because they were often the most practical option. The tactical necessity of first men wasn't because commanders loved the drama. It was because, given the limitations of pre-modern military technology, it was often the least bad option. There's a quote, I think from a Roman military manual, though I'm not certain, that goes something like, "The siege is won not by those who build the finest engines, but by those who can make men willingly approach the wall." That's it exactly. All the clever tactics and engineering in the world didn't matter if you couldn't get soldiers to actually attack. The reward system for first men solved that problem. Here's something that's interesting from a historical perspective. As military technology improved, the tactical necessity of first men actually increased for a while before it decreased. Early gunpowder weapons, 1400s to 1500s, made walls more vulnerable but also made approaching them more dangerous. Cannons could breach walls, creating opportunities, but muskets and early guns made the approaches to those breaches absolute meat grinders. So you had more opportunities to assault, but each assault was deadlier, which meant you needed even more motivation for volunteers, which meant bigger rewards, more formalized systems, more elaborate honor structures. The Forlorn Hope system reached its peak during exactly this period, the 1700s and early 1800s, when gunpowder weapons made breaches common, but the approaches to those breaches were incredibly dangerous. Only later, when artillery became powerful enough to simply destroy walls entirely, and when military tactics shifted toward combined arms and suppressive fire, did the need for first-man volunteers finally decrease. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we get to how the system ended, we need to understand one more thing. How did anyone actually survive these assaults? Because some did. Not many, but some. And their survival wasn't just luck. There were techniques, tactics, specific actions that increased your chances from almost certainly dead to probably dead but maybe not. Understanding these survival tactics gives us our most intimate view yet into what it actually felt like to be that first man, to climb that ladder, to face the impossible and somehow live to tell about it. That's where we're going next, into the specific, practical, moment-by-moment decisions that meant the difference between a name on a memorial and a name in the history books. Okay, so you volunteered. You're standing at the base of a siege ladder or at the edge of a breach, knowing that statistically you're about to die. But you're also human, which means despite everything, part of you believes you'll be the exception. So what do you actually do? Are there techniques, strategies, tricks that increase your odds from 1 in 10 to maybe 1 in 5? The answer is yes, and the fact that soldiers developed and passed down these survival tactics tells us something important. They weren't just blindly charging to their deaths. They were trying, desperately cleverly, to survive. Let's start with the most basic tactic. One that sounds simple but made a huge difference. Numbers on the ladder. You know how in horror movies the monster picks off victims one by one? Siege defenders were basically doing that. A single soldier climbing a ladder was easy to target, easy to kill. But what if you had multiple soldiers on the same ladder climbing simultaneously? Medieval military engineers figured this out. The more men on a ladder at once, the harder it became for defenders to push that ladder away. Think about the physics. An empty 40-foot wooden ladder weighs maybe 150 pounds. Difficult to push, but doable if you've got a couple of strong defenders with poles. But that same ladder with 6 armoured soldiers on it, you're now trying to push over 500 plus pounds at an awkward angle while those soldiers are actively fighting back. The math changes dramatically, so the tactic was, load the ladder. Get as many men climbing as the structure could support. This created problems. Soldiers were literally breathing down each other's necks, couldn't move freely, but it made the ladder much harder to dislodge. Historical accounts from medieval sieges specifically mention this technique. One chronicler describes seeing ladders so thick with men they looked like ants on a stick. Not the most flattering image, but it shows how common this tactic was. There's even evidence that ladder design evolved to support this. Later, medieval ladders were built thicker, with reinforced rails, specifically to handle multiple climbers. They were heavier to carry, but more stable once placed. But here's the problem with loading ladders. You're all bunched together, which makes you an easier target for area effect weapons. Like, say, a barrel of gunpowder rolled into the cluster of you. Which brings us to the second major survival tactic, covering fire. This one's crucial but often overlooked in dramatic retellings. The men climbing weren't alone. They had support from soldiers on the ground whose entire job was to shoot at the defenders on the walls. In Roman times, this meant archers and slingers positioned to target anyone who appeared on the battlements. In medieval sieges, crossbowmen. In the gunpowder era, musketeers. The goal wasn't necessarily to kill defenders, though that was a bonus. The goal was to suppress them, to make them keep their heads down, to create hesitation. If a defender knows that the moment he leans over the wall to drop a rock or push a ladder, he's going to take an arrow to the face, he's going to be more cautious. And that hesitation, that fraction of a second where the defender is choosing safety over aggression, could be the difference between a climber making it up or getting killed. There are accounts from the Siege of Acre during the Third Crusade where English longbowmen were specifically tasked with covering the ladder assaults. They fired in volleys, creating a near-constant rain of arrows at the battlements. Muslim defenders described it as impossible to show themselves without being shot at. Did it make ladder climbing safe? Hell no, but it made it survivable, for some. Here's a related tactic that's fascinatingly clever: the shield bearers. Some ladder assaults included soldiers whose entire job was not to climb, but to hold large shields at the base of the ladder, creating partial cover for the climbers. These pavis shields, tall, rectangular, often with a prop to keep them standing, could block arrows and projectiles from certain angles. Again, not perfect protection, but better than nothing. And crucially, it meant the first men up weren't completely exposed from the moment they started climbing. Medieval military treatises, and yes, these existed, armies took this stuff seriously, specifically mention the importance of shield bearers in escalade operations. It was a recognized valued role. Now let's talk about timing, because this was perhaps the most critical variable. Night attacks had major advantages. Darkness made it harder for defenders to aim, harder to see exactly how many attackers were coming, harder to coordinate defense. Many successful ladder assaults happened in the hours before dawn, dark enough to provide concealment, but light enough that attackers could see where they were going. There's a wonderful account, wonderful in the military history sense, not the humanitarian sense, from a French siege in the 1300s where attackers used rope ladders with hooks. They approached the walls in complete silence on a moonless night, hooked their ladders over the battlements using long poles, and climbed up before defenders even realized an assault was happening. The first indication the defenders had of the attack was when French soldiers were already on the walls, fighting the guards. By the time the alarm was raised, the attackers had a foothold. The element of surprise saved lives, attacker lives at least. But night assaults had risks too. Coordination was harder. You could get separated from your unit, attack the wrong section of the wall, or fall off your ladder because you couldn't see properly. It was a trade-off. Some commanders preferred dawn attacks. The psychological impact of seeing thousands of soldiers charging at first light could be devastating to defender morale. Plus, you had the whole day ahead for follow-up waves if the first assault failed. The timing debate continued throughout military history. Different commanders had different preferences, and honestly, both approaches had successful examples. Here's a survival tactic that sounds almost comical but was genuinely used. Padding. At the Siege of Badajoz, yes, that one again, there's documentation that some forlorn hope soldiers carried large bags stuffed with hay or straw. The idea was simple. When you reached the top of the breach and needed to drop down into the fortification, you threw the bag first, then jumped onto it. This served two purposes. First, it literally cushioned your landing. Second, it might trigger any traps, pressure plates, covered pits, tripwires that defenders had set up. Did it work? Sometimes. The soldiers who thought of this and survived wrote about it, so we know at least some found it useful, but obviously carrying a giant bag of hay while climbing a breach under fire had its own problems. There's dark humor in this, right? You're facing cannons and muskets and swords, and your clever plan is a pillow. But when you're in an impossible situation, you take any advantage, no matter how small. Speaking of clever tricks, let's talk about reconnaissance. Smart commanders tried to scout siege targets before assaulting them. They'd send observers, sometimes at night, sometimes in disguise, to study the walls, look for weak points, count defenders, observe patrol patterns. The goal was to find the path of least resistance. Maybe there's a section of wall that's slightly lower, or a corner where defensive fire has a blind spot, or a time of day when defenders change shifts and are briefly disorganized. This information would be passed to the Forlorn Hope leaders. Aim for the third tower from the left. There's a crack in the wall there, and the defender positions have worse angles. It didn't guarantee survival, but it meant you weren't charging blindly. You were making an informed suicide attempt, which is better. The Romans were particularly good at this kind of reconnaissance. They'd sometimes spend days observing a city before attacking, looking for patterns and vulnerabilities. At New Carthage, Scipio's discovery of the lagoon weakness came from local informants, but also from Roman engineers studying the tides and fortifications carefully. Knowledge was survival, even in suicide missions. Here's a tactic that required serious coordination: the feint and main assault. Remember how we talked about multiple attacks on Badajoz? Some were diversionary, meant to draw defenders away from the main assault. This was intentional, strategic, and actually improved survival odds for everyone involved. If defenders have to spread their forces across multiple threatened points, each point is less heavily defended. The castle attack at Badajoz, while it failed to breach the walls, did pull French defenders away from other positions. Those defenders couldn't be in two places at once. From an individual soldier's perspective, being part of a coordinated multi-point assault meant better odds than a single-point attack where every defender could focus on you. Commanders understood this. That's why they often planned simultaneous assaults even when they knew some would fail. The failures helped the successes. Cold? Yes. Effective? Unfortunately, yes. Let me tell you about another survival factor that's less about tactics and more about luck, but informed luck. Experienced soldiers developed an almost sixth sense for danger. They'd notice when a section of wall seemed too quiet, probably an ambush, or when defenders were acting strangely, probably preparing a surprise, or when the breach looked wrong somehow, probably trapped. This wasn't supernatural, it was pattern recognition from years of combat. Your brain subconsciously processes thousands of tiny details and sometimes produces a feeling of something's off. Soldiers who listened to that instinct and adjusted their approach, veering slightly left, waiting a moment before charging, changing their climb angle, sometimes survived where others didn't. You can't really teach this. It comes from experience, which creates a dark survival paradox. The soldiers most likely to survive were veterans who'd done this before, but veterans were also smart enough to know how dangerous it was and less likely to volunteer. The young soldiers who volunteered didn't have this experience, which made them braver but also more vulnerable. Here's something that sounds brutal but was genuinely a survival tactic: using casualties as cover. Once bodies started piling up, and they did quickly, some soldiers would deliberately position themselves behind fallen comrades. Dead and wounded bodies could stop arrows, absorb impacts, provide physical barriers. This is documented in multiple siege accounts. At Badajoz, survivors described using the bodies of the fallen as breastworks, basically improvised sandbag walls made of corpses. Is this horrifying? Absolutely. Is it disrespectful to the dead? By modern standards, yes. But in the moment, when you're trying not to become one of those bodies, you use whatever cover is available. The soldiers who did this often felt guilty later, but they survived to feel guilty, which was the point. Let's talk about one more tactic that's fascinating, the counter-push. Sometimes, when defenders tried to push a ladder away, attackers on the ground would push back. Not the climbers, they were busy not falling, but soldiers at the base, using poles or even their hands to lever the ladder back toward the wall. This created a weird tug-of-war, with defenders trying to push the ladder away and attackers trying to keep it in place. Whichever side had more leverage and strength would win. Historical illustrations from medieval manuscripts actually show this happening. Soldiers at the base of ladders, bracing them, pushing against defender poles. It must have been chaotic, exhausting, and bizarre. But again, if it kept the ladder in place and gave climbers a few more seconds to reach the top, it was worth doing. Here's the thing about all these tactics. None of them made ladder assaults safe. The best survival tactics in the world only moved your odds from almost certainly dead to probably dead. But humans are optimists. We focus on the maybe not part of probably dead. And when you're desperate, when the rewards are great enough, you'll take any improvement in odds, no matter how small. The soldiers who survived, the Quintus Trebellii, the Forlorn Hope veterans with their VS badges, they'd use some combination of these tactics, plus a healthy dose of luck. They'd climbed when others climbed, benefited from covering fire, picked the right moment, noticed something others missed, and didn't get hit by the random arrow that killed the guy next to them. They couldn't necessarily explain why they survived. I did everything right and got lucky isn't much of a how-to guide. But their survival proved it was possible, which kept the next generation of volunteers believing they could do it too. And that belief, however delusional, kept the system working. But here's what's interesting. As we've been discussing, this whole system, the volunteering, the rewards, the tactics, remained remarkably consistent for nearly 2,000 years. From ancient Rome through the Napoleonic era, the basic pattern held, until suddenly it didn't. By the mid-1800s, the era of individual glory-seeking in military assaults was ending. New technologies, new tactics, new philosophies about warfare were making the first-man-up system obsolete. The question is, what changed? Why did something that worked for millennia suddenly stop working? And what replaced it? That's the transition we need to understand. From individual heroism to collective action, from glory to discipline, from the forlorn hope to modern military doctrine. Imagine being a military officer in 1850, reading accounts of sieges from just 50 years earlier and thinking, we used to do what? Because that's essentially what happened. Within a single generation, the entire system we've been discussing, volunteers climbing ladders for glory, forlorn hopes charging breaches for promotions, first man-up heroics, went from standard military practice to historical curiosity. The shift was so dramatic that by the late 1800s, military historians were writing about the forlorn hope in the past tense, almost nostalgically, like people discussing dueling or jousting tournaments. Can you believe we used to do that? So what changed? Why did something that worked for 2,000 years suddenly become obsolete? The answer isn't simple. It never is with historical transformations. But there were three major factors that converged in the mid-1800s to kill the glory-seeking first-man-up system: technology, tactics, and values. Let's start with technology, because that's the most obvious. By the 1840s and 1850s, artillery had become devastatingly powerful. We're not talking about the relatively weak cannons of the medieval period, or even the early gunpowder era. We're talking about rifled artillery, cannons with spiral grooves inside the barrel that made projectiles spin, dramatically improving accuracy and range. These new guns could hit specific sections of wall from a mile away. They fired explosive shells that detonated on impact, not just solid shot. and they could maintain sustained fire for hours without overheating or breaking. What this meant for siege warfare, walls became pointless. If you could just blow a massive hole in a fortification from a safe distance, why would you need soldiers to climb ladders? You'd shell the walls into rubble, then march your army through the gaps. No ladders required, no first man necessary. The fortress city of Sevastopol during the Crimean War, 1854 to 1855, is a perfect example. British and French forces besieged this Russian stronghold, but instead of preparing ladder assaults like Wellington had done 40 years earlier, they simply bombarded it for months with hundreds of artillery pieces. When they finally assaulted, they didn't need forlorn hopes to charge narrow breaches. The walls had been reduced to rubble in so many places that troops could advance on broad fronts, with artillery continuing to provide support. The siege still cost thousands of lives. Siege warfare remained brutal, but it didn't require individual volunteers to go first. Everyone went together, protected by overwhelming firepower. The ladder assault, the cornerstone of siege warfare for millennia, had become tactically irrelevant. But technology alone doesn't explain the shift, because even as late as the 1860s and 1870s, there were still situations where infantry had to assault fortified positions. The American Civil War had plenty of these. Think of the assault on Fort Wagner in 1863, or the fighting around Petersburg in 1864 to 1865. So why weren't they using the forlorn hope system? That's where the tactical and philosophical changes come in, and this is where it gets really interesting. Throughout the 1700s and early 1800s, military thinking had been evolving. Theorists like Prussian General Karl von Clausewitz and French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, wearing his military strategist hat, were developing new ideas about warfare. One key concept: mass and concentration of force. Instead of sending small groups of elite volunteers to create breakthroughs, the new thinking was to concentrate overwhelming numbers at decisive points. Don't send 30 men in a forlorn hope. Send 3,000 men in a coordinated assault. This approach had several advantages. First, it didn't rely on individual heroics. You didn't need exceptional volunteers, you just needed adequate numbers. Second, it was more predictable. You could calculate odds, plan logistics, coordinate with artillery support. Third, it was more sustainable. You weren't sacrificing your best, most experienced soldiers in the first wave. But there was a deeper philosophical shift happening too, and this is what really killed the first man-up system: the professionalization of warfare. Remember how we talked about honor culture in ancient and medieval societies? How individual glory was paramount? How military reputation was tied to personal courage? That was fading. By the mid-1800s, military establishments were becoming more bureaucratic, more systematic, more corporate, for lack of a better word. Officers were trained in military academies following standardized curricula. Promotions were based increasingly on education and time in service, rather than battlefield exploits. Armies were organized around efficiency and coordination rather than individual heroism. The Prussian military system, which became the model for most European armies, explicitly emphasized discipline and collective action over individual initiative. The Prussian General Staff, essentially the brain of the army, valued careful planning, logistics, and coordination. They saw battles as puzzles to be solved through superior organization, not as stages for individual glory. Individual heroics weren't just unnecessary in this system, they were actually problematic. A soldier who broke formation to charge ahead might win personal glory, but he'd also disrupt the carefully planned assault, create gaps in the line, and potentially get people killed. So the system actively discouraged the very behavior it had once rewarded. There's a great quote from Helmut von Moltke, the legendary Prussian field marshal, who said something like, "Strategy is a system of expedients. It is more than knowledge. It is the application of knowledge to practical life, the development of thought capable of modifying the original plan in accordance with circumstances." Notice what's missing. Any mention of individual courage, personal glory, or heroic first charges. It's all systems, plans, modifications based on circumstances. War as management problem, not heroic adventure. This philosophical shift had profound effects on how armies operated. In the old system, a volunteer stepping forward for the forlorn hope was celebrated as a hero. In the new system, a soldier doing the same thing would be seen as undisciplined, grandstanding, possibly endangering the mission with his individual initiative. The values had completely inverted. Let me give you a specific example of this shift in action. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, French forces, still operating somewhat on older glory-seeking principles, often launched brave but uncoordinated attacks. French officers would lead charges crying "à la baïonnette," to the bayonet, expecting their men to follow them in glorious assaults. The Prussian response? Coordinated volleys of rifle fire supported by artillery. No dramatic countercharges, no individual heroics. Just disciplined, systematic killing. The French got slaughtered. Not because they weren't brave, they absolutely were, but because bravery without coordination was no longer enough. The Prussians won through superior organization, not superior courage. This war was a wake-up call for European militaries. It proved that the new system worked better than the old. Glory was nice, but winning was better. After 1871, almost every major military in Europe adopted some version of the Prussian system, which meant the old glory-seeking, first-man-up approach was finished. But there's another factor we need to discuss: the changing nature of military demographics and motivation. In the ancient and medieval periods, armies were relatively small and composed mostly of volunteers, men who'd chosen military life. These were the kinds of people who might be motivated by glory, advancement, and reputation. By the mid to late 1800s, most European countries had adopted conscription, mandatory military service. Armies became massive, composed largely of ordinary citizens who didn't particularly want to be there. These conscripts weren't motivated by glory. They wanted to survive their service and go home. The promise of a Corona Morales or a Forlorn Hope promotion didn't appeal to them because they didn't want to be career soldiers. They wanted to be farmers, shopkeepers, workers, anything but soldiers. So even if commanders had wanted to use the first man up system, they'd have struggled to find volunteers. The volunteer pool had dried up. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but illustrative, about a Prussian officer during the 1870s who jokingly tried to revive the Forlorn Hope tradition. He asked for volunteers to lead an assault, offering promotion to the first man over the enemy fortification. Nobody volunteered. The soldiers just stared at him. Eventually, one conscript said something like, "Sir, we'll go when you order us, but we're not volunteering for that." The officer reportedly laughed and dropped it. The old system was dead. Here's where it gets philosophically interesting. Was this shift an improvement? From a pure military effectiveness standpoint, yes. The new system produced better results with lower casualties. Relatively speaking, war remained horrific. Coordinated assaults with artillery support were more successful than individual heroics. From an ethical standpoint, maybe also yes. The old system explicitly encouraged men to volunteer for near-certain death, using rewards that exploited their desperation and ambition. The new system just ordered everyone to fight together, which is more honest if nothing else. But something was lost too. The old system, for all its exploitation and horror, offered individual soldiers a path to transcendence, and nobody could become a somebody through a single act of extraordinary courage. It was exploitative, yes, but it was also empowering in a weird way. The new system offered no such path. You were a cog in a machine. Do your job, follow orders, survive if you're lucky. No glory, no transcendence, no personal storylines. Which is better? The system that exploits human ambition and courage, or the system that treats everyone as interchangeable parts? I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that the shift happened, and by 1900 the world we've been discussing, of Chrono Moralis and forlorn hopes and first man glory, was gone. Military historians studied it, novelists romanticized it, but nobody practiced it anymore. Well, almost nobody. Because here's the thing, while the formal systems disappeared, the underlying human dynamics didn't. The desire for glory, the willingness to risk everything for advancement, the psychological appeal of being special, these didn't go away just because military tactics changed. They just found new expressions. In World War I, 1914 to 1918, even with modern weapons and industrial warfare, you still had soldiers performing acts of extraordinary individual courage. Going over the top first, leading charges, volunteering for dangerous reconnaissance missions. But now they did it for different reasons and within different systems. Instead of Chrono Moralis, they got Victoria Crosses or Medals of Honor. Instead of social mobility through glory, they sought meaning through service. The packaging changed, but some of the core psychology remained. And if we look at modern military special operations, Navy SEALs, SAS, Special Forces, don't we see echoes of the old system? Elite volunteers, extremely dangerous missions, outsized rewards in terms of prestige and career advancement? The forlorn hope didn't really die, it evolved. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we draw parallels to modern times, we need to look at one particularly stark example of how suicide missions continued even as the old glory system faded, and how the motivations changed when individual advancement was removed from the equation. Because in the 20th century, nations discovered something disturbing. You don't need to promise glory and rewards to get soldiers to volunteer for suicide missions. Sometimes ideology is enough. Sometimes duty is enough. Sometimes desperation is enough. The suicide missions continued, but the reasons changed. And understanding those changes tells us something important about human nature, about what drives people to sacrifice themselves. That's the comparison we need to make next. Ancient glory seekers versus modern suicide volunteers. Same action, completely different psychology. There's a photograph from World War II that haunts me. It shows a young Japanese pilot, maybe 20 years old, dressed in his flight suit, smiling at the camera. Hours after that photo was taken, he flew his plane directly into an American warship. A kamikaze attack. Deliberate suicide. Now, compare that pilot to a Roman soldier volunteering for the Chrono Moralis, or a British lieutenant leading a forlorn hope at Badajoz. Same action, volunteering for near certain death. Same outcome, most died, but completely different motivations. And understanding these differences tells us something profound about how human psychology and social systems interact to produce the same extreme behavior. Let me be clear up front, we're not going to glorify or justify any of this. We're going to understand it, which is different. Let's start with the most obvious comparison. The Japanese kamikaze pilots of 1944 to 1945. The word kamikaze literally means divine wind, referring to typhoons that supposedly saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 1200s. In Watututu, it became the name for pilots who deliberately crashed their planes into enemy ships. Between October 1944 and August 1945, approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots died in these attacks. They sank or damaged hundreds of Allied ships, killed thousands of sailors, and created such psychological terror that some American servicemen said they feared kamikazes more than conventional attacks. Now here's the critical question. Why did they volunteer? And they did volunteer mostly. This wasn't a death sentence handed to criminals or losers. These were often university students, educated young men from good families who raised their hands when asked, but their motivations were fundamentally different from our Roman or British volunteers. The Roman soldier climbing the wall wanted the corona muralis, personal glory, family advancement, social mobility. It was transactional, risk death, potentially gain everything. The kamikaze pilot wasn't promised promotion or wealth. He was promised nothing, materially. He would die. That was certain, not probabilistic. And there was no reward waiting for him. He'd be dead. So why volunteer? The answer is complex, but it comes down to a few interconnected factors: ideology, social pressure, and the complete absence of individual advancement as motivation. Japanese military culture in World War II was built on a radical interpretation of Bushido, the samurai code. This wasn't the historical samurai code, which was actually quite pragmatic. This was a modern invention, a militaristic ideology that emphasized death over surrender, collective over individual, nation over self. Soldiers were taught from training that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. Not achieving glory, dying itself was the point. Your death served the nation. That's what mattered. There's a phrase from the period, 7 lives for the country. The idea that you should be willing to reincarnate 7 times and die for Japan each time. That's not hyperbole, that was literal belief, taught in schools and military training. Compare that to the Roman system. Romans respected death in battle, sure, but they wanted you to live. The corona muralis was only awarded to survivors. The glory was in surviving impossible odds, not in dying. The kamikaze system inverted this completely. The glory was explicitly in the death, in the sacrifice. Surviving a kamikaze mission would have been shameful. You'd failed in your duty. That's a fundamentally different psychology. But here's what makes this even more complex. Many kamikaze pilots didn't actually believe the propaganda. We know this because some left letters, diaries, final writings that reveal their actual thoughts. A pilot named Ichizo Hayashi wrote to his family, "I am nothing but a particle of iron attracted by a magnet, the American aircraft carrier." He wasn't expressing joy or glory. He was expressing resignation. He was a particle, not a person. He'd been reduced to a weapon. Another pilot, Heiichi Okabe, wrote, "I cannot say that the wish to die for the emperor is genuine coming from my heart. However, it is decided for me that I die for the emperor." That's chilling. It is decided for me. These men were trapped by a system that made refusing almost impossible. The social pressure, the shame that would fall on their families, the peer expectations, the ideology drilled into them. It created a situation where volunteering wasn't really a choice. A Roman soldier could decline to volunteer for the corona muralis without dishonor. It was dangerous. Of course you might not volunteer. Nobody would shame you. But a Japanese pilot in 1944, when the call came for kamikaze volunteers saying no meant you were a coward, that you'd shamed your family, that you'd betrayed everything you were supposed to believe in. So they volunteered. But was it really voluntary? This is where comparing ancient and modern suicide missions gets philosophically complicated. The ancient system, corona muralis, forlorn hope, was exploitative, yes, but it was also, in a genuine sense, voluntary. Soldiers had real choices, weighed real options, and made decisions based on personal cost-benefit analysis. Many modern suicide missions remove that element of choice through overwhelming social, ideological, or coercive pressure. Let me give you another example. Suicide bombers in various modern conflicts. Research on suicide bombers, and there's a surprising amount of academic study on this, shows that motivations vary widely, but they rarely include personal advancement. Some are motivated by revenge. They've lost family members to enemy action and want retaliation. Some are motivated by ideology, religious or political beliefs that justify or demand martyrdom. Some are motivated by social pressure. Their community expects it, their families will be honoured, and often financially compensated if they do it. But almost none are motivated by personal gain in this life. The reward, if any, is promised in an afterlife they believe in. That's radically different from the Roman or British systems, where the reward was concrete, material, and immediate if you survived. Here's a question worth considering. Which system is more exploitative? The ancient system that promised real rewards and genuinely let you choose, but used your ambition and hope to get you to risk death? Or the modern systems that remove choice through ideology and social pressure, but don't pretend you'll personally benefit? I honestly don't know. Both are manipulative. Both get people killed for organizational goals. Maybe comparing degrees of exploitation is pointless. But there is one modern military context where the ancient model survived almost intact. Special Operations Forces. Think about Navy SEALs, British SAS, Delta Force, Russian Spetsnaz. These units recruit volunteers for extremely dangerous missions. They offer prestige, career advancement, elite status, basically the Corona Moralis with modern branding, and they get plenty of volunteers. Why? Because the motivational structure is similar to the ancient system. You're volunteering as an individual for personal advancement into an elite group that offers tangible rewards. Yes, there's patriotism and duty, but there's also ambition. There's also the desire to be special, to be part of an elite few, to have Navy SEAL on your resume forever. Sound familiar? It's the same psychology that made Roman soldiers compete for the Corona Moralis. The difference is success rate. Modern Special Forces training is designed to be brutally difficult but not suicidal. Hell Week for Navy SEALs is notorious. Cold, wet, exhausted, pushed to physical and mental limits, but it's not designed to kill you. The death rate in training is very low. Compare that to Forlorn Hopes, where the death rate in actual missions was 70 to 80%. Modern Special Forces wouldn't accept those odds. They use technology, tactics, and training to dramatically improve survival rates. So it's the ancient motivational model, but with modern risk management. Best of both worlds, arguably. Here's another interesting comparison. Volunteer rates. In ancient Rome, medieval Europe, and Napoleonic Britain, getting volunteers for suicide missions was apparently not that difficult. Soldiers competed for the positions. The system worked reliably for centuries. In modern conflicts, getting volunteers for actual suicide missions, where death is certain, not just probable, is much harder even with intense ideological indoctrination. The Japanese had to create elaborate cultural systems to make kamikaze volunteering acceptable. Suicide bomber organizations spend enormous resources on recruitment and indoctrination. It's not easy to get people to volunteer for certain death. Why? What changed? I think it comes down to the reward structure. Humans are fairly consistent. We'll take extreme risks for extreme rewards, but we need to believe there's a chance we'll collect those rewards. Ancient suicide missions, despite the name, weren't actually suicide. They were probably fatal but maybe not missions. That maybe not was psychologically crucial. It let volunteers believe they'd survive, collect their rewards, and live to enjoy them. True suicide missions, where death is certain and there's no material reward, go against deep human instincts. You need powerful ideological systems to override those instincts. And even then, it's difficult. The kamikaze system only worked for about a year before Japan surrendered. Suicide bomber organizations have high turnover, not because bombers change their minds, but because each one is used up in an attack. They can't sustain the model long term. The ancient model, by contrast, was sustainable for millennia. Why? Because survivors became recruiters. They proved it was possible. They walked around with their Corona Muralis or VS badges, living proof that you could risk everything and win. That made the next generation of volunteers possible. Let me tell you about one more modern parallel that's less obvious but equally interesting. Extreme sports athletes, free solo climbers, base jumpers, big wave surfers. These people voluntarily do things with the death rates that rival historical suicide missions. Alex Honnold's free solo of El Capitan, climbing 3,000 feet with no rope, had an objective death rate if he fell of 100%. Yet he did it voluntarily for no material reward. Why? The psychology is actually similar to our ancient volunteers. It's about transcendence, achieving something extraordinary, being remembered, proving yourself capable of what others can't do. It's about glory in a modern, individualistic form. The difference is nobody's asking them to do it for organizational goals. They're doing it entirely for personal reasons. But the underlying psychology, I will risk everything to achieve something extraordinary, that's the same. And society treats them similarly to how ancient societies treated military heroes. We celebrate them, make documentaries about them, put them on magazine covers. They get the modern equivalent of the Corona Muralis. Fame, book deals, speaking fees. So in a weird way, the ancient model survives in extreme sports, just divorced from military context. What does all this comparison tell us? I think it reveals something fundamental. Humans have always been capable of extraordinary courage, and societies have always found ways to channel that courage toward organizational goals. The specific motivations change: personal glory, ideology, duty, peer pressure, but the underlying capability remains constant. Under the right circumstances, with the right incentives or pressures, people volunteer for near certain death. That's simultaneously inspiring and terrifying. Inspiring because it shows human capacity for courage and self-sacrifice. Terrifying because it shows how easily that capacity can be exploited. The ancient system, for all its faults, was at least honest about the exploitation. We need someone to climb first. It's dangerous. Here's what we'll give you if you survive. Transactional, clear, respectful of individual choice. Some modern systems hide the exploitation behind ideology, making volunteers believe they're dying for a cause greater than themselves, when often they're just dying for someone else's political or military goals. Which is worse? I'll leave that for you to decide. What I know is this. Throughout history, in every era, in every culture, there have been people willing to be first into danger. The reasons vary, the rewards differ, the contexts change, but the willingness persists. And that brings us to our final question. What does all of this, 2,000 years of siege ladders and forlorn hopes, of Corona Muralis and kamikaze pilots, what does it teach us? What lessons can we draw from understanding why humans volunteer to die? Because this isn't just history. These patterns are still with us, in military contexts and beyond, and understanding them might help us recognize when courage is being channeled toward worthy goals, and when it's being exploited for unworthy ones. That's what we need to explore in our conclusion. The lessons, the legacy, and why any of this still matters. So here we are, nearly 2 hours into this journey, and we've climbed siege ladders with Roman soldiers, charged breaches with British forlorn hopes, explored the psychology of volunteers, and compared ancient glory seekers to modern suicide missions. But the question that matters most is, Why does any of this matter now? We're not storming castles anymore. Most of us will never face a siege ladder or a fortified wall. So what do these 2,000 years of desperate men climbing toward probable death actually teach us about being human? Let me start with something personal. When I first started researching this topic, I thought I'd find a simple story about courage. Brave men doing brave things, maybe some tragic deaths, roll credits. But the deeper I dug, the more complicated it became. These weren't just heroes. They were also victims of systems designed to exploit their desperation, ambition, and psychological blind spots. They were brave and manipulated, courageous and foolish, inspiring and tragic, all at once, all the same people. And I think that complexity is the first lesson. Humans are never just one thing. We want simple stories. We want heroes who are purely good, villains who are purely evil. But real people, including these volunteers throughout history, are messy combinations of noble motives and selfish ones, of courage and fear, of wisdom and delusion. The Roman soldier climbing for the Corona Moralis? He genuinely was brave. You can't deny that. But he was also ambitious, calculating, and probably somewhat delusional about his odds. He could be exploited because he wanted something badly enough to take irrational risks. Does understanding the exploitation diminish the bravery? I don't think so. If anything, it makes it more human, more relatable. Because we all have desires that make us vulnerable to exploitation. We all want advancement, recognition, escape from our circumstances, and powerful systems, whether ancient militaries or modern corporations or social structures, have always found ways to harness those desires to their own ends. Recognizing that isn't cynical, it's honest. The second lesson is about incentive structures, and this one's probably the most practically applicable to modern life. Throughout this story, we've seen how powerful the right incentives can be. The Corona Moralis got men to climb walls. Forlorn Hope promotions got men to charge breaches. The promise of fame gets people to free Solo El Capitan. Incentives work. They channel human motivation towards specific behaviors. That's not news. Economists and psychologists have known this forever, but seeing it play out in life and death situations makes it visceral. Here's what strikes me. The most effective incentive structures understood human psychology deeply. The Romans knew that soldiers wanted glory and social mobility. The British knew that poor officers wanted career advancement. The systems were tailored to what people actually wanted, not what designers thought they should want. Modern organizations often forget this. They create incentive structures based on what sounds good in theory. People should be motivated by purpose. Or, employees should want to help the company, without asking what people actually want. The ancient military systems were brutal and exploitative, but they worked because they understood human nature accurately. There's a lesson there for anyone trying to motivate people, though hopefully toward less deadly goals. But there's a darker side to this lesson. If you know what motivates people, you can make them do almost anything. The kamikaze system worked, briefly, because it understood that young Japanese men had been raised in a culture where refusing would bring unbearable shame. The suicide bomber recruiters understand that combining revenge, ideology, and social pressure can override survival instinct. Understanding incentives gives power. That power can be used ethically or unethically, and we, as individuals, need to be aware when we're being motivated by external incentive structures, so we can evaluate whether those motivations serve our actual interests. Ask yourself, when you're being asked to sacrifice, time, money, health, whatever, what's actually being offered in return? Is it real, like the Corona Moralis? Or is it abstract, like company culture or team spirit? Not all sacrifice is exploitation, but it's worth examining the incentives. The third lesson is about the persistence of human nature. What's remarkable about this entire story is how consistent the patterns are across time. Ancient Rome, medieval Europe, Napoleonic Britain, World War II Japan. The contexts are wildly different, but the underlying dynamics remain surprisingly similar. Humans want recognition. We want to transcend our circumstances. We want to be remembered. We want to be special. And we're willing to take extraordinary risks to achieve these things. That hasn't changed in 2,000 years. It probably won't change in the next 2,000. Technology evolves, tactics change, political systems come and go. But core human motivations, the stuff that makes someone raise their hand and volunteer for danger, that's remarkably stable. Which means the patterns we've been discussing aren't just historical curiosities. They're insights into permanent features of human psychology. Whenever you see people volunteering for extreme risk, whether it's military combat, dangerous jobs, extreme sports, or even entrepreneurial ventures with terrible odds, you're seeing these same patterns play out. Understanding those patterns helps us understand ourselves and the people around us. The fourth lesson is about the nature of courage itself. We tend to think of courage as this pure, uncomplicated virtue. Someone faces danger, overcomes fear, and acts bravely, simple. But our journey has shown that courage is rarely that clean. The volunteers we've discussed were brave, no question, but their bravery was tangled up with youth, optimism bias, social pressure, ambition, honor culture, peer expectations, and sometimes desperation. Does that make them less brave? I don't think so. I think it makes courage more interesting. Pure, untainted courage, if it even exists, is rare. Most courage is mixed with other motives, enabled by psychological quirks, and operating within social systems that reward it. And that's okay. That's human. We don't need our heroes to be perfectly motivated to respect what they did. The British soldiers who kept charging the breaches at Badajoz, they were brave. The fact that they were also young, optimistic beyond reason, and motivated by class ambition doesn't change that. Courage is doing the thing despite fear, regardless of why you're doing it. Here's the fifth lesson, and this one's about memory and legacy. Remember how we talked about fama, Roman concept of fame that outlasts death? That idea that you could achieve a kind of immortality through being remembered? Well, it worked. We're sitting here thousands of years later talking about Quintus Trebellius and Sextus Digitus. We remember the Forlorn Hope volunteers, we know their stories. They achieved what they were seeking, immortality through memory. But here's what's interesting. Most of the soldiers who died on these ladders and breaches are forgotten. We remember a handful of names, a few specific incidents, but thousands died anonymously. The survivors got their glory, the dead got mostly nothing, which makes you wonder, is gambling for immortality worth it when the odds are so bad? If only 1 in 100 volunteers is remembered, and the other 99 are forgotten along with being dead, is that a good bet? From an individual perspective, probably not. From a societal perspective, if you're trying to motivate soldiers, it works beautifully, because humans are bad at calculating odds. This tension between individual rationality and social manipulation has been present throughout this entire story, and it's present in modern life too. How many people sacrifice themselves, their health, their relationships, their happiness, chasing fame or success or recognition, when statistically most won't achieve it? The ladder is still there. It just looks different now. Lesson 6. The evolution of values. We've watched values transform over 2,000 years, from individual glory to collective discipline, from honor culture to professional bureaucracy, from celebrating the first man up to seeing that behavior as problematic. This shows that our deepest values, the things we think are fixed and natural, are actually contingent and changeable. Romans genuinely believed that dying gloriously in battle was one of the highest achievements possible. Modern Western culture thinks that's somewhat sad, that living a long, happy life is preferable. Who's right? Maybe both. Maybe neither. The point is that values change, and recognizing that helps us be less dogmatic about our current values. It also helps us understand people from other times and places. The kamikaze pilots weren't crazy. They were operating within a completely different value system. Understanding that doesn't justify the system, but it helps us understand the individuals within it. And maybe, hopefully, it makes us think critically about our own value systems. What do we believe is worth dying for? Worth sacrificing for? Are those beliefs truly ours, or have they been instilled by systems with their own agendas? Good questions, hard questions, worth asking. Here's lesson 7, and it's about the relationship between courage and foolishness. Throughout this journey, we've seen that the line between these two qualities is razor thin and often just determined by outcome. The soldier who climbs first and survives is a hero. The one who climbs first and dies is, well, still brave, but also kind of foolish for taking such terrible odds. Same action, different outcome, different judgment. This should make us humble about judging people's decisions. We look at the Forlorn Hope volunteers and think, that was crazy. The odds were terrible. But we're judging from safety, from distance, with full knowledge of outcomes. The volunteers were making decisions in the moment, with incomplete information, under psychological pressures we've discussed, hoping desperately to be the exception. Were they foolish? Maybe, but they were also human, doing their best with the cognitive tools available to them. Before we judge historical figures or contemporary ones for taking foolish risks, we should remember our own foolish risks. The times we drove too fast, invested badly, trusted the wrong person, took the job we shouldn't have taken. We all climb our own ladders. We all make our own bets with terrible odds. We're just fortunate that most of our mistakes aren't fatal. Lesson 8. The power of stories. This entire system, from Corona Morales to Forlorn Hope, was sustained by stories. The survivors told tales of their exploits. Poets wrote songs about heroes. Historians recorded the glory. Those stories motivated the next generation of volunteers. They created a narrative. If I'm brave enough, skilled enough, lucky enough, that could be me. Stories are powerful. They shape behavior, influence decisions, and create reality. The modern equivalent? Every success story about entrepreneurs, athletes, celebrities, they're creating the same dynamic. If I work hard enough, if I'm talented enough, if I'm lucky enough, that could be me. And yes, some people do achieve those successes, just like some soldiers survived the ladders. But the stories overrepresent success and underrepresent failure, creating a skewed perception of odds. We should be aware of this. Not cynical, but aware. Stories are real, but they're selective. For every success story you hear, there are many failures you don't. That doesn't mean don't try. It means try with clear eyes, understanding actual odds, not story-inflated odds. Let me share the 9th lesson, and this one's about sacrifice. Throughout history, societies have needed people willing to sacrifice themselves for collective goals. That's just reality. Sometimes those sacrifices are necessary. Defending against invasion, protecting the vulnerable, maintaining critical systems. The ethical question isn't whether sacrifice should exist. It probably always will. The question is, how do we ensure that sacrifice is genuinely necessary, fairly distributed, and not exploited? The ancient systems failed this test spectacularly. They took desperate people, promised them glory, and sent them to die for goals that often weren't truly necessary. Modern militaries are better. They use technology and tactics to minimize sacrifice. They compensate fairly. They don't rely purely on exploitation. But every organization, every society, every system needs to constantly ask, Who are we asking to sacrifice? Why? Is it truly necessary? Are we exploiting their vulnerabilities? These questions matter in context beyond military. Who sacrifices in our economy, our healthcare system, our social structures? Are those sacrifices necessary or exploitative? The ladder still exists. We just need to be honest about who we're asking to climb it and why. Lesson 10 is about the role of chance. Despite all the tactics, psychology, incentives, and bravery, a huge component of who survived these ladders was just luck. Random chance. Being slightly to the left when the rock fell. The arrow that missed by inches. The defender who looked the other way at the crucial moment. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge because we want to believe success is earned through skill, effort, and merit. And those things matter. They improve odds, but they don't eliminate chance. The survivors weren't necessarily the bravest, the strongest, or the smartest. They were the luckiest. This should create humility. When we succeed, we should remember the role of chance. When others fail, we should remember it might not be their fault. The volunteers who died on these ladders weren't less capable than the survivors. They just got unlucky. That randomness is inherent to life, not just warfare. Recognizing it makes us more compassionate and less arrogant. And finally, Lesson 11. What it all means. We've spent hours exploring why men volunteered to climb siege ladders first. We've examined incentives, psychology, tactics, and values across 2 millennia. But at its core, this story is about what humans are capable of. The heights of courage and the depths of exploitation, the power of hope and the cost of ambition. These men, Roman soldiers, medieval knights, British lieutenants, and yes, even kamikaze pilots, they were all trying to transcend their circumstances through extraordinary action. They wanted to be more than ordinary. They wanted to matter. And in a way, they succeeded. We're talking about them. We remember what they attempted, if not always their names. But the cost was staggering. Most died. Most were forgotten. Most exchanged their lives for promises that were never fulfilled. Was it worth it? That's the wrong question. It happened. It was real. These were real people making real choices within real constraints. The better question is, what do we do with this knowledge? I think we honor these men by understanding them fully, not romanticizing their sacrifice, but not dismissing their courage either, by recognizing both the bravery and the exploitation, by learning from the systems that channeled human motivation so effectively while being vigilant against those same systems exploiting us, and maybe, just maybe, by being a little more understanding of the desperate chances people take, because we're all climbing our own ladders, hoping desperately that we'll be the ones who make it to the top. You know, when I started this story hours ago, I asked, what could make a man volunteer to be first up a siege ladder? I think we've found the answer, or rather answers, plural, because it was never just one thing. It was ambition and desperation, courage and delusion, social pressure and personal choice, exploitation and opportunity, hope and fear, all tangled together in the messy reality of being human. The ladder was always more than just a ladder. It was a test, opportunity, a trap, and a promise all at once. And the men who climbed it were never just heroes or victims. They were both and neither and everything in between. They were human, beautifully, tragically, courageously, foolishly human, just like us. Thank you for taking this journey with me. I know nearly 2 hours is a long time to spend thinking about siege warfare and military psychology, but I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. These stories, of Roman soldiers competing for golden crowns, of British lieutenants charging breaches at Badajoz, of psychological systems that made impossible choices seem reasonable, they're not just history. They're windows into human nature that still matters today. If you enjoyed this deep dive, if it made you think or feel something, I'd genuinely appreciate if you'd leave a comment. Tell me, if you'd been offered the Corona Moralis, would you have climbed? What modern ladders are you facing in your own life? I read every comment, and your thoughts always inspire new stories. And please, subscribe if you haven't already, because there are so many more stories like this. Historical moments that reveal profound truths about what it means to be human. I'm already researching the next one, and trust me, it's going to be just as deep, just as fascinating, just as worth your time. Until then, take care of yourselves. Don't climb any siege ladders unless the reward is really truly worth it. And remember, courage and foolishness are separated by the thinnest of lines, and sometimes the bravest thing is knowing which side you're on. I'll see you in the next story. Sleep well,